Some stories aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be felt, in the silence of empty land, in the weight of a place that remembers more than it says. For generations, warnings were passed down not as legend but as instruction. Stay away. Don't speak of it. Don't go back. We call these things mysteries because we've run out of better words. Tonight, we're not here to explain them away. We're here to sit with them, to ask the questions no one's fully answered, and to listen to what this land has been trying to tell us all along. Let's begin. Along the northeastern coast of Newfoundland, where the Atlantic meets jagged cliffs and dense boreal forest, archaeologists still find traces of a people who called this land home for thousands of years before it had any other name. Stone tools, fire pits, ochre-stained bones, painted red in a tradition so central to their identity that European settlers began calling them simply Red Indians. These were the Beothuk, and by the early 19th century, they were gone. Not relocated, not absorbed into another nation. Gone in a way that still troubles historians who study it. The official record is, in some ways, painfully clear. European fishing crews began arriving on Newfoundland's shores as early as the 1500s, drawn by cod-rich waters. Contact was rarely peaceful. The Beothuk retreated inland, away from the coastline that had sustained them for generations, cut off from the seasonal hunting and fishing grounds their entire way of life depended on. Disease followed, tuberculosis in particular, moving through a population that had no immunity and increasingly nowhere left to go. By the time colonial authorities began attempting diplomatic contact, it was already very late. In 1829, a woman named Shanodithut died in St. John's. She is remembered as the last known full-blooded Beothuk. Her drawings and accounts, recorded shortly before her death, remain one of the only first-hand windows into a culture that otherwise left no written record of itself. When she died, an entire nation's living memory, centuries of language, ceremony, and oral history, died with her, or so the official narrative holds. But is that the whole story? Some historians have questioned whether extinction is even the right word. Were there Beothuk individuals who intermarried with Mi'kmaq or Innu communities before the population collapse, their descendants absorbed rather than erased? Oral traditions among some Indigenous and Métis families in Newfoundland and Labrador suggest the possibility, though genealogical evidence remains thin, and the historical record was kept almost entirely by the settlers who displaced them, not by the Beothuk themselves. Then there are the smaller, stranger gaps. Population estimates for the Beothuk before European contact vary wildly, from several hundred to several thousand, because no one thought to count them until it was already too late to know for certain. Their language, Beothukan, is considered a linguistic isolate, unrelated as far as we can tell to any neighboring indigenous language. Where did it come from? Why does it stand alone? Fewer than 400 words of it survive, recorded secondhand by colonists with no linguistic training. And Shanodithut's own drawings raise questions that remain unresolved. She sketched maps of Beothuk movements, ceremonies, encounters with settlers, but also symbols and events that no accompanying account fully explains. Historians continue to debate what some of them mean. What we're left with, then, is not a mystery in the sense of the unexplained, but a mystery in the sense of the unrecoverable. A people who existed, resisted, and vanished within the span of roughly 3 centuries, largely undocumented by anyone who might have understood them from the inside. Was the loss of the Beothuk truly total, or does some fragment of them, in blood, in memory, in the handful of words that survive, remain, waiting to be recognized for what it is? The coastline they once depended on is still there. The people who named it first are not. And the question of what exactly was lost may be one history can no longer fully answer. If the story of the Beothuk is one of a people erased from the historical record almost entirely, the story that follows is its strange mirror image. Not a people forgotten, but a single man remembered so vividly, so mythologized, that even his final resting place has become a battleground of rumor, lawsuits, and unanswered questions. At Fort Sill, Oklahoma, there is a small cemetery reserved for Apache prisoners of war. Rows of modest headstones sit beneath the open sky of the southern plains, marking the graves of men, women, and children who were never allowed to return home. Near the center of that cemetery stands a rough pyramid of stones, capped with a stone eagle, marking the grave of Goyathle, known to history as Geronimo. He died here on February 17, 1909, having spent the final 23 years of his life as a prisoner of the United States government. He was never permitted to return to the Arizona homeland he had fought so fiercely to defend. By the time of his death, Geronimo had become something unusual for a native leader of his era, a celebrity. He appeared at the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, selling photographs of himself and bows he'd carved. He rode in Theodore Roosevelt's 1905 inaugural parade. He sat for countless photographs, dictated an autobiography, and became, for a certain kind of American audience, a symbol of a vanishing frontier, simultaneously feared and romanticized. It's a strange contradiction that follows him even now. A man imprisoned for resisting American expansion, later paraded as one of its most marketable icons. His burial at Fort Sill should, by most accounts, have been the quiet end of that story. It was not. The mainstream historical record is straightforward enough. Geronimo caught a chill after falling from his horse on a cold night, reportedly while returning home from selling bows in Lawton. Pneumonia set in quickly, and within days, he was dead. He was buried according to Apache tradition, among his fellow prisoners, in ground he never chose and never called home. For decades, that was where the story ended, at least publicly. Then, in the 1980s, and again with greater intensity in 2005, a very different narrative began to surface. One that had, in fact, been quietly circulating for generations among certain circles at Yale University. The claim is this. In 1918, a group of Yale students belonging to the secretive Skull and Bone Society allegedly traveled to Fort Sill and, under cover of night, opened Geronimo's grave. According to the story, they removed his skull, along with several bones and personal effects, and transported them back to New Haven, where they were placed inside the Society's windowless headquarters. A building members call, appropriately enough, the Tomb. Is this simply a lurid piece of campus folklore, the kind every elite institution seems to generate about its secret societies? For a long time, that's precisely how it was dismissed. Skull and Bones has always cultivated an air of mystery, and stories about looted relics, stolen skulls, and clandestine rituals are practically part of its brand mythology. Almost every account of the group includes some version of a skull kept in a display case, supposedly belonging to Pancho Villa, or Martin Van Buren, or, in this case, Geronimo. Surely, skeptics argued, this was just one more tale in a long tradition of Ivy League myth-making. But then, in 2005, something happened that made the story considerably harder to dismiss. A letter surfaced, written in 1918 by a Skull and Bones member named Winter Mead to another member, F. Truby Davison. In it, Mead referenced a visit to the Society's tomb, during which he was reportedly shown a skull identified to him as Geronimo's, said to have been taken from the grave at Fort Sill earlier that year. The letter did not prove the theft had occurred, but it proved at minimum that members of Skull and Bones themselves believed, or claimed to believe, that it had. Among those said to have taken part in the alleged raid, according to later accounts in Society lore, was Prescott Bush, father of one American president, grandfather of another. Skull and Bones has never confirmed the story. In 2006, the organization issued a statement denying that Geronimo's remains were held within the tomb, while carefully declining to explain the origins of the letter or the persistent internal lore surrounding it. That combination, flat denial paired with an unwillingness to account for the evidence, did little to settle the matter. In 2009, the story moved from campus legend to federal courtroom. Harlan Geronimo, a great-grandson of the Apache leader, along with other descendants and members of the Apache community, filed a lawsuit against Skull and Bones, Yale University, and the United States government. The suit invoked the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, seeking the return and reburial in the mountains of the Southwest of whatever remains might still exist. The case was ultimately dismissed on procedural grounds, without ever resolving the central question at its heart. Were human remains, allegedly belonging to Geronimo, actually inside that windowless building in New Haven? And if so, are they there still? The uncertainty is compounded by a second, quieter controversy, one that has nothing to do with secret societies at all. Some historians and Apache oral historians have questioned whether Fort Sill even marks the correct grave. Cemetery records from the period were kept inconsistently. Headstones were sometimes placed years after burial, based on memory rather than documentation. Several Apache families have suggested, over the decades, that the location commonly pointed to as Geronimo's grave may not be entirely accurate, that shifting markers, imprecise record-keeping, or deliberate obscurement during a period of ongoing hostility toward Apache prisoners may have left the exact location uncertain, even to those responsible for maintaining it. Layer these two uncertainties together, and something strange emerges. We are left with a resting place that may or may not be correctly marked, containing remains that may or may not be complete, following a possible theft that a powerful and secretive institution has neither confirmed nor adequately explained, more than a century after the fact. What would it mean if the letter is accurate? What would it mean if a piece of a man who spent decades resisting the erasure of his people and his homeland was taken, without consent, by descendants of the very institutions that displaced them, kept as a curiosity, a trophy, a talisman of power passed quietly between generations of the American elite? And if the story is false, if it's simply an elaborate piece of Yale mythology that got mistaken, over time, for history, why has the university's response never fully closed the door on the alternative? Why does a 1918 letter, written by a Skull and Bones member to another Skull and Bones member, describe a skull display in such specific and confident terms, if none of it was true? There is something particularly haunting about this kind of mystery. Not a disappearance shrouded in ancient fog, but one wrapped in modern paperwork. Court filings, university statements, a single surviving letter, and a grave marker that may or may not sit above what it claims to. Perhaps the remains are exactly where they've always been said to rest, at Fort Sill, undisturbed. Perhaps they are not. Either way, the question Harlan Geronimo and his family raised in that 2009 lawsuit has never truly been answered, and the tomb at Yale has never opened its doors to settle it. Somewhere between a soldier's grave on the Oklahoma plains and a windowless building on a university campus in Connecticut, the final resting place of one of the most photographed, most mythologized Native American leaders in history, remains, in the fullest sense of the word, unresolved. What exactly lies beneath that stone pyramid at Fort Sill, and what, if anything, lies inside the tomb at Yale? A century later, no one outside a small circle of society members can say for certain. And they aren't saying. If the mystery of Geronimo's remains lives in courtrooms and old letters, the next one lives somewhere far more elusive, in the folds of mountain terrain that few outsiders have ever fully mapped, and in a legend that has drawn treasure hunters into the Wallowa Mountains of northeastern Oregon for well over a century. The land itself is worth pausing on, steep canyons cut by glacial rivers, alpine lakes so still they mirror the peaks around them with unsettling precision. This is Nez Perce country, Nimiapoo as the people call themselves, a homeland their ancestors had occupied for thousands of years before the mid-19th century brought settlers, treaties, and eventually, betrayal. It was here in 1877 that a chief named Heinmot Tuyalakekt, known to history as Chief Joseph, made a decision that would echo for generations. Rather than surrender his people's ancestral land to a government that had already broken its word once, he chose to run. What followed was one of the most remarkable military campaigns in American history, not for its scale, but for its desperation and its brilliance. Roughly 750 Nez Perce men, women, and children, along with their horses and what possessions they could carry, fled northeastern Oregon in an attempt to reach political asylum in Canada. Pursued by multiple columns of the United States Army, they traveled over 1,100 miles through some of the most difficult terrain in the American West, fighting several engagements along the way and in more than one instance, outmaneuvering forces that significantly outnumbered them. It has been studied by military historians ever since as an extraordinary feat of tactical retreat. They came within roughly 40 miles of the Canadian border before finally being surrounded in the Bear Paw Mountains of Montana in October of 1877. There, exhausted, starving, and reduced by casualties and desertion, Chief Joseph surrendered. His words at that surrender have become one of the most quoted speeches in American history, a statement of exhaustion, grief, and resignation, ending with the line, "I will fight no more forever." The Nez Perce were promised they would be returned to their homeland. That promise, like the ones before it, was not kept. They were instead sent to reservations in Kansas and later Indian Territory, in present-day Oklahoma, where disease and unfamiliar climate killed many who had survived the retreat itself. Chief Joseph spent the rest of his life advocating, largely in vain, for his people's return to the Wallowa Valley. He died in 1904, still in exile, on the Colville Reservation in Washington state. According to the reservation physician who examined him, the official cause of death was recorded simply as a broken heart. This much is documented, verified, and uncontested. What follows is not. Sometime after Joseph's death, and gaining considerable momentum through the 20th century, a legend took hold. That somewhere along the route of that desperate 1877 flight, or perhaps hidden earlier in the Wallowa homeland itself, the Nez Perce had concealed a substantial cache of gold. The theory takes a few different forms, depending on who is telling it. One version holds that Nez Perce bands had been quietly mining or trading for gold in the years before the conflict, accumulating wealth that they deliberately kept hidden from encroaching settlers and prospectors, aware of how quickly word of gold could bring ruin to a territory. Another version suggests the gold was gathered specifically during the flight itself, perhaps looted, perhaps simply carried as portable wealth, meant to fund a new life in Canada or to buy safe passage through hostile territory. A third, more elaborate version claims the gold was buried deliberately at some point along the retreat, when it became clear that carrying it further would slow the band down or draw unwanted attention, with the intention of someone returning for it later. No one ever did, or if they did, no one ever spoke of it. Is there anything to substantiate this? Here, the historical record grows notably thin. Contemporary military records, journals, and Nez Perce oral histories recorded in the decades following the conflict make no clear corroborated reference to a significant gold cache. The Nez Perce economy of the period was based primarily on horse breeding. They were, and remain, renowned as exceptional horsemen and breeders, particularly of the spotted Appaloosa, along with hunting, fishing, and trade. Large-scale gold accumulation doesn't fit comfortably into what historians know of their economic life at the time. And yet the legend persists, fueled in part by a broader cultural fascination with lost frontier treasure that swept the American West throughout the 20th century, attaching itself to nearly every notable historical figure and event of the era, from outlaws to cavalry payrolls to, in this case, a fleeing band of refugees. But dismissing it outright may be too quick a conclusion, and here the story grows more genuinely uncertain rather than simply speculative. The Wallowa Valley and surrounding mountains do have a documented history of gold discovery, both before and after the Nez Perce War. Prospectors found gold in nearby districts throughout the 1860s and 1870s, which was, in fact, part of what drove the pressure to force the Nez Perce off their land in the first place. Given this, it is not implausible that individual Nez Perce families, living in gold-bearing territory for generations, may have possessed small amounts of gold, or gold-bearing ore, obtained through trade, discovery, or barter. Far from a legendary hoard, but a modest private reality that could, over generations of retelling, have been exaggerated into something far larger. There's also the matter of what happened to Nez Perce possessions during and after the surrender. Historical accounts describe soldiers and settlers looting abandoned campsites along the retreat route, taking horses, tools, and personal items left behind by exhausted or fleeing families. If there was ever a modest amount of gold among those possessions, it may well have been seized in these encounters and simply never documented as such, indistinguishable at the time from any other confiscated item. Then there are the treasure hunters themselves, and they have never fully stopped looking. Since at least the early 20th century, prospectors and amateur historians have combed sections of the Wallowa Mountains and portions of the retreat route through Idaho and Montana, searching for some physical trace of the legend. Some claim to have found old campsites, disturbed ground, or geological features matching descriptions passed down through local folklore. None of these findings have ever been independently verified as connected to a Nez Perce gold cache. No gold has ever been definitively recovered and tied to the legend. The Nez Perce tribe itself, for its part, has generally treated the story with the reserved skepticism of a people who have watched their history repeatedly reshaped by outsiders into something more marketable, more mysterious, more profitable than the documented reality of dispossession and survival. And that, perhaps, is the most uncomfortable question at the center of this particular mystery. Why does this story persist so stubbornly when the historical evidence for it is so slight? Is it because some fragment of it is true, a family's modest gold, hidden and never recovered, growing into legend through generations of retelling? Or is it because a story of hidden treasure is simply easier and more comfortable for outside audiences to sit with than the actual history it obscures? A people who lost their homeland, their freedom, and hundreds of their own to a broken promise, running 1,100 miles not toward riches, but toward the mere possibility of remaining free, somewhere in the folds of those Wallowa canyons, or perhaps nowhere at all. The truth of Chief Joseph's gold remains exactly where it has always been, just out of reach, resistant to confirmation or denial, a century and a half after the retreat that gave birth to the legend. Was something buried in that flight north, meant to be reclaimed and never was? Or is the real treasure simply the story itself, still being dug for, long after the people who might have known the truth were silenced by exile, disease, and time? And deep in the sandstone canyons of the American Southwest, where the Rio Grande cuts through New Mexico and Arizona's high desert, there's a cave system that has drawn treasure hunters for over a century. Local ranchers call it different names in different counties. Old maps mark it with symbols that don't quite match modern topography. And somewhere within this vast arid landscape, if the legend is to be believed, lies gold that once belonged to an Aztec emperor who died nearly 2,000 miles to the south, in a city that would later become Mexico City. The story of Montezuma's treasure has been told so many times, in so many forms, that separating its origins from its embellishments has become a historical puzzle in itself. Here is what's verified. Moctezuma II, ruler of the Aztec Empire, was captured by Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés in 1520, during the earliest, most volatile days of the Spanish conquest of Mexico. He died shortly afterward, under circumstances still debated by historians, killed by his own people during an uprising, according to Spanish accounts, or possibly murdered by the Spanish themselves once he was no longer useful as a hostage, according to alternative readings of the period's fragmentary records. In the chaos that followed his death, known as La Noche Triste, or the Night of Sorrows, Cortés and his forces were driven out of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, suffering heavy losses as they fled across the city's causeways under attack. Spanish accounts describe soldiers so weighed down with looted gold that many drowned attempting to cross the canals, unable to release the wealth they'd carried out of the fallen city. This much is documented in Spanish colonial records, cross-referenced with archaeological evidence from Tenochtitlan itself. What isn't documented, what exists only in legend, is what happened to the treasure that didn't drown in those canals, that didn't make it back to Spain, that some say never left Aztec hands at all. The most persistent version of the story holds that before Cortez could seize the full extent of Moctezuma's wealth, loyal subjects or surviving nobility spirited a significant portion of it away, transporting it far north of the capital, beyond the reach of Spanish forces, to be hidden until it could safely be reclaimed. Why north? Into territory that, at the time, had little to no connection to the Aztec Empire's political or trade networks. The legend rarely explains this convincingly, which is, for skeptics, one of its most obvious weaknesses. The Aztec Empire's sphere of influence extended through central and southern Mexico. The idea of a caravan traveling thousands of miles into what is now the American Southwest, through unfamiliar and often hostile territory, strains against most of what historians understand about Aztec geography and political reach in 1520. And yet the legend didn't stay confined to Mexico. It traveled north with Spanish explorers themselves, and later with American settlers, attaching itself over generations to dozens of specific locations across New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and even as far north as Kansas. Caves, canyons, mountain peaks with suspiciously specific local names: Montezuma's Well near Sedona, Montezuma Castle in the Verde Valley, Montezuma's Chair in the Franklin Mountains near El Paso. Nearly every region of the Southwest, it seems, has its own version of the story, its own cave or canyon rumored to hold the hidden gold. Here's where the story becomes genuinely strange, rather than simply implausible. Several of these locations carry indigenous names and traditions that predate any Spanish or Aztec association entirely. Names given by ancestral Puebloan or later Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache peoples for reasons that had nothing to do with Moctezuma. Montezuma Castle, for instance, is a well-preserved cliff dwelling built by the Sinagua people, a culture entirely unrelated to the Aztec Empire, constructed and largely abandoned centuries before Moctezuma was even born. The name was attached by 19th-century American settlers who assumed, incorrectly, that any sufficiently impressive ancient structure in the Southwest must have Aztec origins. A common misconception of the period, rooted less in evidence than in a romanticized and often inaccurate popular understanding of pre-Columbian history. So why does the treasure legend persist at these sites specifically if the Montezuma connection was a 19th-century mistake to begin with? One theory suggests the legend simply attached itself, retroactively, to already mysterious ruins. That settlers who couldn't explain the sophisticated architecture they found simply borrowed the most famous indigenous name they knew, and the treasure story followed naturally from there, a package deal of assumed grandeur and assumed riches. This explanation accounts for much of the geographic spread, but it doesn't fully address something else: the presence of oral traditions among certain indigenous communities in the Southwest, describing hidden wealth connected not necessarily to Moctezuma by name, but to ancestral stores of value: turquoise, shell, ceremonial objects, deliberately concealed during periods of conflict or displacement, long before any Spanish contact at all. Could these older, unrelated traditions of concealment have blended over centuries of retelling and cultural exchange with the imported Aztec legend, producing a hybrid story that outside observers mistook for a single, coherent treasure map? It's a theory some ethnohistorians find plausible, that what looks, on the surface, like one myth is actually the layered residue of several distinct traditions, compressed by time and retelling into something that sounds unified but isn't. Then there are the more fringe theories, the ones that have fueled actual excavation efforts over the decades. Victorio Peak in southern New Mexico became the site of a genuinely documented treasure hunt beginning in 1937, when a man named Milton Doc Noss claimed to have discovered a cave containing gold bars, skeletal remains, and religious artifacts. Noss's claims led to decades of legal disputes, military involvement, the peak sites within the White Sands Missile Range, and conflicting excavation attempts, none of which produced conclusive public evidence of a treasure. The U.S. Army conducted an official search in 1977 and found, according to their report, nothing of significance. Noss's family and various treasure hunting associations have disputed that conclusion ever since, alleging cover-ups, mismanagement, or deliberate concealment by government or military interests. Is Victorio Peak connected to Moctezuma's gold specifically, or simply another chapter in the broader Southwest treasure mythology, absorbed into the larger legend after the fact? The available evidence doesn't clearly say. What is clear is that people have spent genuine money, genuine years, and in at least one case, genuine legal battles, pursuing a story that may have begun as a 19th century naming error, layered atop older, unrelated indigenous traditions of hidden wealth. Perhaps that's the real shape of this mystery. Not a single treasure waiting in a single cave, but a story assembled from fragments. A real historical flight from a fallen empire, a real tradition of concealment among peoples who had their own reasons to hide what mattered to them, and a real pattern of outside observers overlaying their own assumptions onto structures and landscapes they didn't fully understand. Somewhere in that layering, is there an actual cache of gold, still sealed in some canyon or cave system across the Southwest? Or was the treasure always something else? Knowledge, tradition, ceremonial meaning, mistranslated by those who came looking for metal and never found because they were never looking for the right thing. Not every legend of hidden wealth is really about gold. Some are about people, about entire communities that, by every official account, should no longer exist, yet whose presence, according to persistent and often disturbing testimony, continued for decades after history had already written their ending. The Sierra Madre Occidental stretches for nearly 1,000 miles through northwestern Mexico, a vast, folded mountain range of pine forests, volcanic rock, and canyons so deep and remote that even today, significant portions remain unmapped in any detailed way. It's rugged, punishing terrain, the kind of landscape that swallows roads and defeats casual exploration. And for much of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it was rumored to hide something that both Mexican and American authorities insisted couldn't possibly be there. A surviving band of free Apache living entirely outside the reach of either government, decades after the so-called Apache Wars were declared officially over. The documented history provides the foundation, and it's worth establishing clearly before the speculation begins. By 1886, the surrender of Geronimo, covered earlier in this exploration, is generally treated by historians as the symbolic end of Apache armed resistance in the American Southwest. The Chiricahua Apache who surrendered with him were sent into exile, first to Florida, then Alabama, and eventually to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where many, including Geronimo himself, would live out their remaining years as prisoners of war. That's the narrative taught in most American history courses. A clean, if grim, conclusion. But it was never entirely true, and serious historians have acknowledged as much for decades. Not every Apache band surrendered in 1886. Small, scattered groups, sometimes just a handful of families, sometimes larger bands numbering in the dozens, retreated instead into the Sierra Madre, crossing into Mexican territory where U.S. military jurisdiction couldn't follow, and where Mexican federal authority, particularly in such remote terrain, was often more theoretical than actual. These holdouts became known in both American and Mexican records as the Bronco Apache, or sometimes simply Los Broncos, a term borrowed from Spanish, meaning wild or untamed. For a people who valued self-sufficiency and had spent generations mastering exactly this kind of unforgiving terrain, the Sierra Madre offered something increasingly rare elsewhere on the continent: the possibility of continued freedom, however precarious. What makes this more than a simple historical footnote is how long the evidence of their presence persisted, and how seriously it was taken by people with no obvious reason to invent it. Throughout the early 20th century, Mexican ranchers, miners, and loggers operating in Chihuahua and Sonora reported repeated encounters, raids on livestock, sightings of unfamiliar riders in traditional dress, abandoned camps discovered in areas presumed uninhabited, and in some documented cases, direct, sometimes violent confrontations. These weren't isolated rumors confined to a single remote village. Reports accumulated across a wide geographic area and a span of decades, filed by people whose livelihoods depended on accurately assessing threats in the terrain they worked. Perhaps the most striking documented case involves a woman named Lupe, sometimes called the Apache Girl, captured by Mexican forces in 1927 during a raid on what was described as a small, hidden Apache encampment deep in the Sierra Madre. She reportedly spoke no Spanish, wore clothing distinct from surrounding Mexican and indigenous populations, and displayed customs that observers at the time identified as Apache. Her exact fate afterward is not fully documented in accessible historical records. Some accounts suggest she was placed with a local family, others that she died shortly after her capture. But her existence itself was recorded by multiple contemporary sources, not merely folklore recounted after the fact. Even more remarkably, credible sightings and encounters continued well past the point where most historians assumed any holdout population could realistically have survived. As late as the 1930s, and by some accounts into the 1940s, ranchers in the more remote reaches of the Sierra Madre reported evidence suggesting a small population was still moving through the mountains, still evading contact, still living, as much as circumstances allowed, according to older ways. How does a population maintain complete isolation from two modern nation-states for that long? Here, mainstream historical explanation actually has a reasonably solid answer, even if the full story remains incomplete. The Sierra Madre's terrain was, and in places still is, extraordinarily difficult to traverse. Steep, densely forested, and lacking the kind of infrastructure that would make sustained government presence practical. A small, mobile population, deeply knowledgeable about the land and motivated by the very real danger of capture or worse, could plausibly avoid detection for extended periods, particularly in an era before aerial surveillance or reliable long-range communication existed in such remote regions. What's harder to answer with the same confidence is the question of exactly how long this continued, how many people were involved at any given point, and, perhaps most hauntingly, what ultimately happened to them. Did the last holdouts eventually die of illness or exposure, their small numbers simply unable to sustain a viable population across generations? Did they gradually integrate into local Mexican or indigenous Tarahumara communities, their Apache identity dissolving quietly into surrounding populations over the following decades? Or, as some of the more persistent rumors suggest, did some fragment of that population continue in isolation far longer than official history is willing to credit? This is where the story shifts from documented history into something more speculative, and it's worth pausing to note the difference. Beginning in the latter half of the 20th century and continuing into recent decades, occasional reports have surfaced from hunters, hikers, and rural residents of the Sierra Madre, describing signs of habitation in areas presumed entirely uninhabited. Old, but seemingly maintained camps, evidence of small-scale agriculture in inaccessible canyons, and in a handful of accounts, brief, distant sightings of individuals who quickly vanished into the terrain rather than making contact. None of these later reports carry the same documentary weight as the early 20th century encounters. They exist largely as local testimony, difficult to verify, easy to dismiss as misidentification, folklore, or simple wishful thinking about a story too compelling to let go of entirely. And yet the Sierra Madre remains, even today, one of the least thoroughly explored mountain ranges in North America. Vast sections are accessible only on foot or horseback. Some canyon systems have never been comprehensively surveyed by outside researchers. This is, notably, the same general region where the Tarahumara people have maintained a famously isolated traditional way of life well into the modern era, demonstrating that sustained cultural isolation in this terrain isn't merely theoretical, it has a documented precedent. Does that make continued Apache presence, even in some diminished or transformed form, plausible into more recent decades? Serious historians remain divided and appropriately cautious. Some argue that population viability alone makes long-term survival past the mid-20th century highly unlikely, that any holdout band would have been too small to sustain itself genetically and culturally across so many generations without either growth through contact or eventual dissolution. Others point out that history has repeatedly underestimated the ability of small, determined populations to persist in terrain that outsiders assumed was uninhabitable, and that the documented record, stretching from 1886 through at least the 1940s, already exceeds what most official accounts once claimed was possible. What remains, in the end, is a genuine gap between the tidy narrative of Geronimo's 1886 surrender marking the close of Apache armed resistance, and a body of documented 20th century evidence suggesting that for at least several decades afterward, in the folded, unmapped canyons of the Sierra Madre, that ending simply hadn't happened yet for everyone. Somewhere in that vast mountain range, families continued living according to traditions the rest of the continent had already filed away as history. How long did that continue? Did it ever fully end? Or does some remote corner of the Sierra Madre still hold something the modern world has simply never gotten close enough to find? There's a particular kind of silence that settles over the Black Hills at dawn. Dense stands of ponderosa pine climbing granite ridges, the air cool even in summer, the whole landscape carrying a weight that seems disproportionate to its modest elevation. The Lakota call this place Haisapa. To them, and to the Cheyenne and other Plains nations who considered it sacred ground, these hills were never simply territory. They were the center of the world, a place of origin, of vision, of burial, and, according to a legend that has drawn treasure hunters here for well over a century, of wealth deliberately hidden from those who would come to take the land itself. To understand why, it helps to understand what actually happened here, because unlike some of the mysteries in this exploration, this one begins with a betrayal that is exhaustively documented. In 1868, the United States government signed the Fort Laramie Treaty, which formally recognized the Black Hills as part of the Great Sioux Reservation, land guaranteed in writing to the Lakota people in perpetuity. That guarantee lasted 6 years. In 1874, an expedition led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer confirmed what rumors had already suggested. There was gold in the Black Hills. The discovery triggered an immediate and illegal rush of prospectors onto treaty-protected land, a rush the federal government made only token efforts to prevent, and which it ultimately legitimized by seizing the territory outright in 1877 in direct violation of its own treaty. The Lakota never accepted this seizure as legal. In 1980, more than a century later, the United States Supreme Court agreed with them, ruling in United States v. Sioux, Nation of Indians, that the land had been taken illegitimately and ordering financial compensation. The Sioux nations have refused that compensation ever since, now grown with interest to well over $1 billion, insisting consistently that they don't want money. They want the land returned. That's the documented history. A sacred landscape, a broken promise, a gold rush built on that broken promise, and a wound that remains legally and culturally unresolved to this day. The legend of hidden treasure grows directly out of this history, though it takes several distinct forms depending on which part of the story it attaches to. The earliest version predates the 1874 gold rush entirely, rooted in oral traditions suggesting that the Lakota and neighboring nations were aware of gold deposits in the Black Hills long before Custer's expedition confirmed it, and had deliberately avoided extracting or revealing it, understanding correctly as it turned out exactly what such a discovery would bring. Some accounts go further, suggesting that ceremonial gold objects or naturally occurring gold used in spiritual and decorative contexts were intentionally concealed in caves or sacred sites once the threat of prospecting became apparent, hidden not for later retrieval, but specifically to keep it from ever being found by outsiders. Unlike treasure legends built around greed, this version is built around denial, the idea that concealment was the point, not preservation for future recovery. Is this plausible? Geologically, yes. Gold deposits don't appear overnight, and it stretches credulity to imagine that a people who had inhabited the region for generations, with deep knowledge of its terrain, had never encountered visible surface gold before 1874. Whether that knowledge was treated as sacred, dangerous, practically irrelevant, or some combination of the three is harder to establish definitively, since it depends on oral traditions that were not, understandably, shared freely with the very outsiders whose arrival had already proven so catastrophic. A second version of the legend is more specific and more thoroughly investigated. The story of Custer's own expedition and what may or may not have happened to some of the gold and gold-bearing samples his men encountered. Custer's 1874 expedition included professional geologists tasked with confirming the presence of gold, and confirmed accounts describe soldiers panning creek beds and finding color in nearly every stream they tested. What became of every sample collected during that expedition isn't fully documented in surviving military records, a gap that has fueled speculation for decades about whether some portion of what was found never made it into official reports, quietly pocketed by individual soldiers or officers rather than logged and turned over through proper channels. This is less a mystery of vast buried treasure and more a mystery of accounting, a gap in the paper trail that historians can identify but not fully close. The third, and by far the most elaborate version of the legend, concerns the years immediately following the 1876 Battle of the Little Bighorn, in which Custer and much of his command were killed by a combined force of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. In the chaotic period that followed, as the U.S. Army intensified its campaign against the Northern Plains nations, and as bands scattered under increasing military pressure, some accounts, largely undocumented in any contemporary written source but persistent in later folklore, suggest that certain Lakota bands buried sacred objects, ceremonial items, and yes, in some versions, gold itself, in locations throughout the Black Hills, anticipating that they might be forced from the region entirely, and wishing to protect what mattered most from confiscation or desecration. This version is the hardest to verify and the easiest to dismiss as invented, precisely because it emerged and grew largely through non-native retellings decades after the fact, absorbing elements of the broader lost Indian gold trope that attached itself to indigenous nations across the American West throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, a trope this exploration has already encountered more than once. Serious ethnohistorians tend to treat it with considerable caution, noting that the material culture most likely to have been protected during this period wasn't gold at all, but ceremonial pipes, medicine bundles, and other sacred objects whose value was spiritual rather than monetary, items whose loss would represent something far more devastating to Lakota communities than any quantity of gold. And yet, dismissing the entire legend outright runs into its own complications. Throughout the 20th century, treasure hunters and amateur historians conducted repeated searches across the Black Hills, particularly in the more remote canyon systems of what is now Custer State Park and the surrounding Black Hills National Forest. Some claim to locate old cache sites, disturbed ground consistent with deliberate burial, or artifacts that couldn't be conclusively dated or attributed. None of these findings has ever been authenticated as connected to the treasure legend specifically, and the Lakota nations themselves have generally responded to these searches with the same weary skepticism they've shown toward outside treatment of their history more broadly, an awareness that the Black Hills have already been ransacked once for gold, and a reluctance to encourage a second round of digging into ground they consider sacred, regardless of what may or may not lie beneath it. This, perhaps, is the deepest irony sitting at the center of this particular mystery. The Black Hills were seized specifically because of gold, a resource extraction so aggressive and so devastating to Lakota sovereignty that it remains, a century and a half later, the subject of unresolved legal and moral reckoning. And now, layered on top of that history, is a persistent cultural fascination with finding still more gold hidden somewhere within the same land, as though the region's sacred significance were measured in ounces rather than in the ceremonies, burials, and origin stories that actually define it for the people who call it the center of the world. Perhaps that tension is the real answer to why this legend endures, regardless of its evidentiary weaknesses. It reflects something true, even where its details remain unverified, that the Black Hills hold something the United States government wanted badly enough to break a treaty for, and something the Lakota nations have refused, for well over a century, to let go of in return, even when refusing means turning down over $1 billion in compensation. What exactly is buried in those hills? Gold, ceremonial objects, something else entirely, or nothing at all beyond the memory of what was taken? And if something genuinely remains hidden there, is the more pressing question really where it is, or whether it should be found by anyone but the people the land already belongs to? Not every mystery in this story involves buried objects. Some involve buried beliefs, ideas so powerful and so threatening to those in power that an entire government mobilized to stop them, culminating in one of the deadliest single incidents of violence against Native Americans in United States history. In the winter of 1889, in a remote stretch of Nevada near Walker Lake, a Paiute man named Wovoka fell gravely ill during a total solar eclipse. According to his own later account, he died briefly during that illness and was taken to the spirit world, where he was shown a vision, a message from the Creator, meant to be carried back to the living. What Wovoka described upon recovering was both a prophecy and a set of instructions. If native peoples across the continent would live righteously, avoid conflict with white settlers, and perform a specific circular dance, now known as the ghost dance, accompanied by particular songs and rituals, a transformation would come. The dead would rise. The buffalo, hunted to near extinction across the plains, would return in overwhelming numbers. The land itself would be restored to what it had been before European colonization, and the suffering of the preceding decades would simply be undone. This is where mainstream historical explanation situates the origin of the movement, and this much is well documented. Wovoka existed. His teachings were recorded by multiple contemporary observers, including sympathetic ethnographers who interviewed him directly. What happened next, however, is where the story becomes considerably more difficult to fully account for. The ghost dance spread with startling speed across the western United States, carried by delegates from dozens of different nations who traveled, in some cases hundreds of miles, to hear Wovoka's teachings directly and bring them home. Within roughly a year, the movement had reached the Lakota Sioux of the Northern Plains, communities already devastated by the loss of the Black Hills, the collapse of the buffalo herds, and the confinement of reservation life following decades of broken treaties. Among the Lakota, the ghost dance took on an additional, more urgent dimension. The belief, adopted by some practitioners, that specially designed ghost shirts, worn during the dance and marked with sacred symbols, could render the wearer physically immune to bullets. Where did this specific belief come from, and how does it fit into Wovoka's original teaching? This is one of the genuine points of historical uncertainty. Wovoka himself, according to several accounts, explicitly rejected the idea of bulletproof garments and denied ever teaching it, suggesting the belief developed independently among Lakota practitioners, perhaps as a localized adaptation shaped by their particular circumstances of ongoing military confrontation, a detail that doesn't appear consistently across all versions of the movement as it spread through other nations. Some ethnographers have suggested the ghost shirt concept may have been influenced by earlier, unrelated spiritual traditions already present among the Lakota, blended with the new prophecy as it arrived. Others have proposed it emerged from a simple, tragic misunderstanding in translation and transmission as the teaching passed from Paiute to Lakota through several intermediary languages and interpreters over a distance of well over 1,000 miles. Whatever its precise origin, the ghost shirt belief, combined with the rapid, visible spread of the dance itself, alarmed federal Indian agents and military commanders, who increasingly viewed the movement not as religious practice, but as the precursor to organized uprising. Standing Rock agent James McLaughlin, in particular, grew convinced that the ghost dance represented a direct threat to reservation authority, and specifically targeted Sitting Bull, the revered Hunkpapa Lakota leader, believing him to be encouraging the movement's spread. On December 15, 1890, Indian police sent to arrest Sitting Bull at his home on Standing Rock Reservation shot and killed him during a confrontation that began, according to most accounts, when his supporters attempted to intervene. 2 weeks later, on December 29, 1890, tension between the U.S. Army and a band of roughly 350 Lakota, led by Chief Spotted Elk, also known as Bigfoot, reached its catastrophic conclusion near Wounded Knee Creek, South Dakota. The band, many of them ghost dance practitioners, had been intercepted en route to Pine Ridge Reservation and was in the process of being disarmed by the U.S. Army's 7th Cavalry when, according to most historical reconstructions, a single shot was fired, its origin still disputed to this day, triggering a massacre. By the time the shooting stopped, somewhere between 250 and 300 Lakota men, women, and children were dead, many of them shot at close range while fleeing, some found as far as 2 miles from the original encampment. This is documented exhaustively so from military records, survivor testimony, and the physical evidence later exhumed from the mass grave in which victims were buried. It stands as one of the clearest, most thoroughly verified atrocities in the history of U.S. Native relations, and it is generally treated in mainstream historical accounts as the effective end of the ghost dance movement, the moment federal authorities crushed it decisively, through violence severe enough to end the hope the prophecy had offered. But did the movement truly end there? This is where the mystery deepens, and where the story becomes less about verified events and more about questions that outside historical records simply weren't positioned to answer. Oral traditions among some Lakota and other Plains communities suggest the ghost dance, in modified and largely private form, continued to be practiced for years, even decades, after Wounded Knee, conducted quietly, away from government observation, by communities who had learned, at devastating cost, the danger of visible religious practice under federal surveillance. If true, this would mean the movement wasn't extinguished so much as driven underground, continuing in a form deliberately designed to leave no documentary trace for outside historians to later examine. There's also the matter of Wovoka himself, who lived until 1932, more than 4 decades after the massacre carried out, in part, in response to his teaching. Accounts of his later life describe a man who continued to be visited by delegations from various nations, who maintained correspondence with followers across the country, and who, by some accounts, never fully renounced his original vision, even as he distanced himself from the specific violence at Wounded Knee and the ghost shirt belief that had contributed to it. What did Wovoka himself believe in those final decades about what had happened to his prophecy? About a promise of restoration that had instead culminated in one of the deadliest days in the history of federal violence against Native peoples. He gave few detailed public accounts, and what survives is fragmentary, filtered largely through outside interviewers whose questions may not have been the ones most worth asking. And then there's the deeper, more unsettling question that sits beneath the entire episode, one that historians have approached with considerably more caution than either believers or skeptics might prefer. Why did a spiritual movement built explicitly around nonviolence and patient faith provoke such an overwhelming, lethal response from federal authorities? Was Wounded Knee truly a defensive military action, as official reports at the time claimed, or was it something closer to a preemptive strike against an idea? A belief system that offered Native peoples something the federal government could not control or co-opt. Hope, rooted entirely outside its own authority, its own treaties, its own timeline of assimilation. The ghost dance itself did not entirely disappear. Versions of it, transformed and adapted, persisted in various forms among some communities well into the 20th century, occasionally surfacing again during later periods of Native political resurgence, including, by some accounts, informing the spiritual dimensions of the 1973 occupation of Wounded Knee itself. The same ground, generations later, once again at the center of Native resistance. What does it mean that a prophecy declared dead in the snow of December 1890 still carried enough weight to echo through an occupation 83 years afterward? Was the ghost dance a movement successfully destroyed, as official history has long maintained? Or was it simply driven somewhere the historical record was never built to follow, still moving quietly beneath the surface of everything that came after? On the morning of August 29, 1911, a starving, terrified man was discovered outside a slaughterhouse near Oroville, California, cornered by dogs and surrounded by a group of curious, wary townspeople who had no idea what to make of him. He wore no shoes. His hair was burned close to his scalp, a traditional sign of mourning among his people. He spoke a language none of the assembled crowd recognized. Newspapers of the time would eventually give him a name that wasn't his own, since he never revealed his true one to any outsider. Ishi, a word from his own language that simply means man. He was, according to virtually all evidence gathered afterward, the last surviving member of the Yahi, a people believed by the state of California to have been entirely extinct for well over 2 decades. To understand the weight of that moment, it helps to understand what had happened to the Yahi in the decades before Ishi walked out of the wilderness. The Yahi were a small tribe, part of the larger Yana linguistic group, who had inhabited the foothills and canyons of what is now Northern California's Tehama and Butte counties for generations, before the California Gold Rush brought an overwhelming wave of settlers into their territory beginning in 1849. What followed, over the subsequent 3 decades, is documented in settler diaries, newspaper accounts, and later historical research with a clarity that leaves little room for dispute and considerably less room for comfort. Organized militias, funded in some documented cases directly by local and state government bounties for native scalps or heads, conducted repeated massacres throughout the region. Historians estimate the broader Yana population, which may have numbered somewhere between 1,500 and 3,000 individuals before contact, was reduced to a small fraction of that number within roughly 20 years, through a combination of direct violence, disease, and forced displacement. By the mid-1860s, following a series of particularly brutal massacres, including one at a site now known as Kingsley Cave, the Yahi were widely presumed by the surrounding settler population to be entirely wiped out. They were not. What happened instead, and what remained almost entirely unknown to the outside world for the following 4 decades, is one of the most remarkable and genuinely unsettling stories of survival in the documented history of California. A small remnant of the Yahi, estimates suggest as few as a dozen to perhaps several dozen individuals, retreated into the rugged, difficult terrain of Deer Creek and Mill Creek canyons, in the foothills of Mount Lassen. There, deliberately and with evident precision, they constructed a way of life built entirely around not being found. They moved their camps frequently. They avoided fires that might produce visible smoke during daylight hours. They walked, according to later reconstructions by anthropologists who studied the sites, in ways specifically designed to avoid leaving traceable trails, stepping on rocks and hard ground where possible, brushing away footprints where it wasn't. They hunted and gathered only what was necessary, careful not to disturb the landscape in ways that might attract attention from the settlers who now populated the surrounding valleys. For this small group, isolation wasn't a circumstance. It was a survival strategy, sustained with remarkable discipline for what would ultimately become more than 3 decades. Sporadic evidence of their continued presence did surface during this period, though it was rarely interpreted correctly by those who encountered it. Ranchers occasionally reported missing livestock or supplies. Hunters and surveyors sometimes found abandoned camps or tools in the canyon backcountry, typically assumed to be old, long-vacated sites rather than evidence of ongoing habitation. In 1908, a survey crew working in the Deer Creek Canyon stumbled directly upon what turned out to be the group's final hidden camp, discovering several Yahi individuals, including, by most reconstructions, Ishi's own mother, elderly and unable to flee with the others. The surveyors, startled and uncertain how to respond, took some of the camp's tools and stores as souvenirs before leaving, a decision that, whatever its intent, stripped the small remaining group of critical winter supplies they had spent considerable effort accumulating. Ishi's mother died shortly afterward. The rest of the group, evidently concluding that their location was no longer safe, dispersed. Over the following 3 years, one by one, the last of Ishi's companions and remaining family died. From illness, from age, from the accumulated toll of decades spent in hiding, until finally, in the summer of 1911, Ishi himself, alone, starving, and with apparently no remaining reason to continue the concealment that had defined his entire life, walked out of the wilderness and into the slaughterhouse yard where he was found. This much is unusually well documented for a story involving such prolonged secrecy, corroborated by physical evidence, contemporary accounts, and later archaeological work at the group's final campsites. What remains genuinely uncertain and considerably more difficult to reconstruct are the finer details of how, exactly, this small group managed such sustained near-total invisibility for more than 3 decades, in terrain that, while rugged, was not so remote as to be entirely beyond the reach of the surrounding settler population. Anthropologists who later studied the Yahi's hidden campsites, most notably Ishi's own collaborators at the University of California, came away with a striking appreciation for the sophistication of the group's concealment techniques, methods that, in some cases, appeared to exceed what had been previously documented among other California native groups facing similar pressures. Were these techniques unique innovations, developed by this particular small band in direct response to their extreme circumstances? Or did they draw on older traditions of concealment and evasion that simply hadn't been documented elsewhere, perhaps because no other group had been forced to sustain them for quite so long, under quite such extreme and specific threat? The available evidence doesn't fully resolve the question, in part because the very success of the Yahi's concealment meant few outside observers ever documented their methods while the group was still practicing them. There's also the matter of Ishi's own account of those final years, which, once he began working with anthropologists Alfred Kroeber and Thomas Waterman at the University of California, San Francisco, proved considerably more limited than researchers had hoped. Ishi spoke about aspects of Yahi culture, language, and technology extensively and, by most accounts, generously, given the circumstances of profound loss and displacement he'd endured. But he remained notably, consistently reticent about the specific final years of the group's hiding, about the exact circumstances of his remaining family members' deaths, and about certain locations and practices that he apparently chose, deliberately, not to share. Was this simply the natural reticence of profound grief, a reluctance to relive the deaths of everyone he had ever known? Or did it reflect something closer to the same instinct for concealment that had defined his entire life until that point? A final, quiet act of protection extended even after there was seemingly nothing left to protect? Ishi lived the remaining 5 years of his life at the University of California's museum in San Francisco, working closely with Kroeber and Waterman, who documented Yahi language, technology, and cultural practices with what was, by the standards of the era, unusual care and evident personal regard for Ishi himself. He died of tuberculosis in 1916, having never revealed his personal name, adhering to the end to Yahi tradition, which held that a person's true name should not be spoken by themselves and should only be used by others after their death. Here the story takes its own uncomfortable turn, one that intersects in its own way with the pattern established earlier in this exploration regarding the treatment of native remains after death. Despite explicit requests from Ishi himself, made while he was still alive, that his body not be autopsied following Yahi custom, an autopsy was performed after his death, reportedly at Kroeber's own reluctant acquiescence to prevailing scientific practice of the era, despite Kroeber's documented personal objections and evident anguish over the decision. Ishi's brain was removed during that autopsy, and, rather than being buried with the rest of his remains, was preserved and eventually sent to the Smithsonian Institution, where it remained in storage, largely forgotten by the broader public, for nearly 90 years. It wasn't until 1999, following renewed advocacy from Native American communities and increased scrutiny under federal repatriation law, that Ishi's brain was finally returned and reunited with his other remains, allowing for a proper Yahi burial, conducted fittingly by the neighboring Pit River and Maidu tribes, since no other Yahi remained to perform it. That resolution, however, doesn't fully close the deeper uncertainty at the heart of this story. Was Ishi truly, as declared at the time and largely accepted since, the very last of the Yahi people? Given how successfully the group had concealed itself for over 3 decades, given how limited outside knowledge of their numbers, movements, and final years genuinely was, can historians say with complete confidence that no other Yahi individual, perhaps someone who separated from the primary group at some earlier point, perhaps someone whose fate was never documented at all, didn't survive somewhere in that same rugged terrain, continuing the same practiced invisibility that had sustained the group for so long? The historical record, remarkably thorough in some respects, remains genuinely silent on this question, precisely because genuine, sustained concealment leaves, by its very design, almost nothing behind for later researchers to find. There is something particularly haunting in that uncertainty, the recognition that an entire people very nearly vanished from history's awareness so completely and so successfully that we cannot say, even now, whether their disappearance from the record was ever truly complete. Ishi walked willingly out of hiding in 1911, but he did so only after everyone else he had ever known was already gone. What then of anyone who might have made a different choice, who might have continued the practiced silence of Deer Creek Canyon rather than stepping into a slaughterhouse yard in Oroville? The Yahi built their survival on being genuinely, deliberately unfindable. Is it possible that somewhere in that history they succeeded even more completely than we know? So completely that their success is, by its very nature, invisible to us still. Long before the massacres of California's Gold Country, another people vanished so completely from the historical record that for centuries, even their true name was lost. Known to us today only through the label French missionaries gave them, borrowed from a diplomatic status that would ultimately fail to save them. Along the northern shore of Lake Erie and stretching into what is now southwestern Ontario, archaeologists have identified the remains of dozens of village sites. Longhouses, palisade walls, ossuaries containing the carefully bundled remains of the dead, reburied according to elaborate mortuary customs shared broadly among Iroquoian-speaking peoples of the region. These sites belong to a confederacy the French called the Neutral Nation, or Nation Neutre, a name given not because these people were passive or without power, but because of their unusual diplomatic position between two much larger and increasingly hostile Iroquoian confederacies, the Huron-Wendat to the north and west, and the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois Confederacy, to the south and east. What the Neutral called themselves in their own language has not survived in any documented form. This alone is worth sitting with for a moment. We know a great deal about how this confederacy lived, traded, and organized itself, largely through archaeological evidence and the accounts of French missionaries and explorers who encountered them in the early 17th century. We do not know what they called themselves. Everything we know about this nation comes to us filtered entirely through the eyes and language of outsiders, a gap that becomes considerably more significant given what happened to them next. By most archaeological and historical estimates, the Neutral Confederacy, at its height in the early 1600s, numbered somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 people, organized across dozens of substantial, well-fortified villages engaged in extensive trade networks, agriculture, and, per their name, a carefully maintained position of neutrality between their more frequently warring neighbors. French Jesuit missionaries, including Jean de Brebeuf, who visited neutral territory in 1640-41 and left one of the only detailed outside accounts of their society, described a populous, organized, and materially prosperous confederacy, hardly a people on the brink of collapse. And yet within roughly a decade of Brebeuf's visit, the neutral nation had ceased to exist as an identifiable political and cultural entity, not through gradual decline, through what appears, in the historical record, to have been a rapid, near-total dissolution. The immediate documented cause sits within a broader, brutal conflict historians call the Beaver Wars, fought throughout the mid-17th century primarily between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and various neighboring nations, driven substantially by competition over fur trade access and territory with European colonial powers. Having already devastated the Huron-Wendat Confederacy in a series of campaigns beginning in 1649, Haudenosaunee forces turned their attention to the Neutral beginning around 1650 or 1651, despite the Neutral's long-maintained policy of avoiding direct conflict with either side. Within a remarkably short span, some historical reconstruction suggests as little as 2 to 3 years, neutral villages across their territory were attacked, their populations killed, captured, or scattered, and the Confederacy's political structure dismantled entirely. This much is documented, cross-referenced between Haudenosaunee oral tradition, French colonial records, and archaeological evidence showing clear patterns of village abandonment and destruction dating to this precise period. What happened to the tens of thousands of individual neutral people who made up that population before its collapse is where the historical record grows genuinely, frustratingly thin. Some answers are reasonably well established. A significant number of neutral captives, particularly women and children, were adopted directly into Haudenosaunee communities, following a well-documented practice among Haudenosaunee nations of incorporating captives to replace population losses from disease and warfare, a practice sometimes called mourning war, in which captured individuals were formally adopted to fill the social and familial roles of deceased community members. Genetic and cultural evidence suggests this absorption was substantial. Contemporary Haudenosaunee communities likely carry the ancestry of neutral individuals absorbed during this period, their distinct identity dissolved into the Confederacy that had defeated them. But adoption alone doesn't account for a population that likely numbered in the tens of thousands. Where did everyone else go? French records from the period document some neutral refugees fleeing westward and southward, seeking shelter among other nations in the Great Lakes region, including groups later identified in historical records among peoples in present-day Michigan and further west. Though tracing specific neutral descent within these later, larger, and more ethnically merged communities becomes increasingly difficult the further removed from the original 1650s displacement. Some Jesuit accounts describe neutral survivors scattered so widely and absorbed so completely into other nations that within a generation or two, distinct neutral identity had effectively ceased to exist anywhere, even among the survivors themselves. Is that truly what happened? A complete cultural dissolution, achieved with unusual speed and thoroughness compared to other displaced Iroquoian peoples of the same era? Or does the apparent completeness of that dissolution simply reflect how poorly documented the aftermath was by outside observers, more so than what may have actually happened on the ground? This is where mainstream historical explanation, however well supported by available evidence, runs directly into the limits of that evidence. French missionary presence in the Great Lakes region during the 1650s and 1660s, while not absent, was considerably less consistent and less detailed than it had been among the Huron-Wendat in earlier decades, particularly as ongoing warfare disrupted trade and mission networks throughout the region. This means the very period when neutral survivors would have been most actively navigating displacement, refuge seeking, and integration into other communities is also among the least thoroughly documented periods in the region's colonial era written record. Archaeological evidence offers some additional insight, though it too carries significant limitations. Sites in southwestern Ontario associated with the neutral show clear evidence of the Confederacy's sudden collapse. Abandoned villages, disrupted trade goods, burial practices interrupted mid-tradition. But archaeological evidence is considerably better at documenting what stopped happening in a given location than at tracing where displaced populations subsequently went, particularly when those populations dispersed across wide geographic areas and integrated into existing communities whose material culture would, over time, simply absorb and reflect the larger group's practices rather than preserving a visibly distinct neutral signature. This gap has led to a range of theories about the more specific fate of neutral survivors, theories that occupy a wide spectrum between well-supported historical inference and considerably more speculative reconstruction. Some historians have proposed that specific communities among later documented nations in the Great Lakes, and even as far as the Ohio Valley, may represent significant concentrations of neutral descent, based on linguistic fragments, oral tradition fragments, and documented migration patterns during the relevant period, though establishing this with confidence is difficult given how thoroughly ethnic identities reorganized throughout the region during the broader disruption of the Beaver Wars era. Others have suggested that some neutral individuals or small family groups may have avoided both adoption and long-distance displacement, instead remaining within or near their original territory in smaller, less visible groupings gradually integrating with subsequent Mississauga Ojibwe populations who moved into the vacated neutral territory in the decades following the Confederacy's collapse. A theory that would mean some neutral ancestry persisted, quite literally, on the same ground their ancestors had occupied, even after their distinct political and cultural identity had ceased to be recognized by outside observers. More speculative still are occasional suggestions, advanced by a handful of researchers and given considerably more weight in popular retellings than in peer-reviewed scholarship, that isolated neutral communities may have maintained some degree of distinct identity for longer than the standard historical narrative allows, perhaps into the early 18th century, in more remote pockets of their former territory, or in small refugee enclaves whose presence simply went unrecorded by the sparse colonial administrative and missionary presence of the era. The evidence for this remains thin, resting largely on the argument that absence of documentation isn't the same as absence of continued existence, particularly given how genuinely limited outside observation of the region was during the relevant decades. What makes the neutral nation's disappearance different from some of the other losses explored in this examination isn't the scale of the violence involved, tragically comparable to other documented conflicts of the era, but the almost total absence of a clear answer to the most basic question their story raises. What actually happened to tens of thousands of individual people in the space of what may have been less than a decade? We can trace the political collapse of their confederacy with reasonable confidence. We can identify some, though certainly not all, of the destinations their survivors eventually reached. But the granular reality, which families went where, how many died in the initial conflict versus the displacement that followed, how many generations it took before neutral identity had genuinely, rather than just administratively, ceased to exist among their scattered descendants, remains almost entirely obscured, not by any deliberate concealment, but by simple absence. An absence of documentation, an absence of continued distinct identity for anyone to record, an absence, ultimately, of anyone left with the standing or opportunity to tell this particular story from the inside. Perhaps that absence is itself the most unsettling element of this mystery. The Beothuk, explored earlier in this examination, left behind a named final survivor and a body of first-hand testimony, however limited, that allows their loss to be documented, mourned, and studied with some specificity. The neutral nation left behind village sites, ossuaries, and a name given to them by outsiders who never learned what they called themselves. Somewhere among the Haudenosaunee communities who absorbed their captives, among the Western nations who may have sheltered their refugees, and quite possibly among Ontario communities living today on or near the very ground their ancestors once occupied. Some fragment of neutral ancestry almost certainly persists. But how much, exactly, has ever been fully identified, honored, or even recognized as such by the descendants who may carry it? 4 centuries after a confederacy of tens of thousands of people effectively vanished from the historical record within the span of a single decade, that question remains, in the fullest and most literal sense, still unanswered. Beneath the shallow brackish waters off Florida's southwestern coast, near what is now Mound Key and Estero Bay, lies the remains of a city. Not a village, but a genuine urban center, built almost entirely from shell. Massive mounds, some rising over 30 feet, constructed layer upon layer from millions of discarded oyster, whelk, and conch shells, engineered with a precision that still puzzles the archaeologists who study them. Canals cut directly through solid shell to allow canoe traffic between residential and ceremonial areas. Watercourts designed, some researchers believe, to hold fish in captivity for later use. An early form of aquaculture unlike anything else documented among indigenous societies in North America. This was Calusa, the capital of the Calusa, one of the most powerful and least understood civilizations to have existed in what is now the United States. What makes the Calusa worth examining isn't simply that they vanished. Many of the nations explored in this examination shared that fate. But how thoroughly a civilization this sophisticated, this well documented at its height, could subsequently disappear so completely that for centuries afterward, even serious historians debated whether descriptions of it had been exaggerated by early chroniclers. Here is what the archaeological and documentary record establishes with reasonable confidence. The Calusa developed one of the few complex, highly stratified societies in North America without relying on agriculture as its economic foundation, an achievement significant enough that anthropologists still cite it as an important exception to broader theories about the relationship between farming and social complexity. Instead, the Calusa built their civilization on the extraordinary richness of their coastal and estuarine environment. Fish, shellfish, and marine resources so abundant and reliably harvestable that they could sustain a population estimated between 10,000 and 20,000 people. Organized under a paramount chief, the Spanish called the Calusa King, who commanded tribute and political allegiance from dozens of subordinate towns across southern Florida. Spanish explorers encountered the Calusa beginning in 1513, when Juan Ponce de Leon's expedition made contact with them during his search for what colonial mythology would later mischaracterize as a fountain of youth. That first encounter went badly for the Spanish. Calusa warriors, in well-organized canoe-based attacks, repelled the landing with enough force that Ponce de Leon himself was wounded, ultimately dying from the injury shortly after returning to Cuba. This set a pattern that would hold for much of the following century. Unlike many indigenous nations who initially attempted diplomacy or accommodation with Spanish arrivals, the Calusa met colonial incursion with sustained, organized military resistance, and largely succeeded in preventing any lasting Spanish settlement within their territory for over 150 years. This resistance is documented extensively, both in Spanish colonial records and, more unusually, from something closer to an inside perspective. In 1566, a Spanish soldier named Hernando de Escalante Fontaneda, who had been shipwrecked and lived among the Calusa as a captive for roughly 17 years, was finally released and wrote a detailed account of Calusa society, language, and customs, one of the only first-hand descriptions of the civilization to survive from someone who had actually lived within it, rather than simply observing from the outside during brief, hostile encounters. Fontaneda's account, along with later Jesuit and Franciscan mission records from failed conversion attempts in the 1560s and 1690s, forms the backbone of most historical understanding of Calusa political structure, religious practice, and daily life. And then, within roughly 2 centuries of that first violent encounter with Ponce de Leon, the Calusa were simply gone, not defeated in a final decisive battle, not forcibly removed to reservations as so many other nations examined in this exploration were. Gone in a manner considerably harder to pin down to any single cause or moment. The mainstream historical explanation for the Calusa's disappearance centers, as it does for so many indigenous nations following European contact, on disease. Old World pathogens, smallpox, measles, and others to which the Calusa, like virtually all indigenous peoples of the Americas, had no prior immunity, devastated Florida's native population throughout the 16th, 17th, and early 18th centuries, spreading through trade contact and mission interactions even in regions, like Calusa territory, that successfully resisted permanent colonial settlement for generations. By some historical estimates, disease alone may have reduced the broader native population of Florida by well over 90% between initial contact and the early 1700s, a catastrophic collapse that would have devastated even a civilization as organized and resilient as the Calusa, regardless of their military successes against direct conquest. This explanation is well supported and broadly accepted, but it doesn't fully account for the specific documented final chapter of Calusa history, which took a considerably stranger turn than simple demographic collapse. By the early 1700s, weakened by generations of epidemic disease, the Calusa faced a second, more immediate threat: increasingly frequent and violent raids by Creek and Yamasee war parties from the north, who had been armed by English colonists in Carolina and incentivized, through the English colonial slave trade, to capture Florida's native peoples for sale into slavery. Spanish records and later historical reconstructions describe these raids intensifying dramatically in the first 2 decades of the 18th century, striking a Calusa population already critically reduced by disease and no longer able to mount the kind of organized, unified resistance that had repelled Spanish incursions 2 centuries earlier. Facing this combined pressure, Spanish records from 1711 and subsequent years describe Calusa refugees, along with survivors from several other South Florida nations, requesting evacuation to Spanish Cuba, a request the Spanish colonial government eventually granted. Multiple waves of evacuation are documented through the 1710s, 1720s, and into the 1760s, when Spain formally ceded Florida to Great Britain and organized what appears to have been a final, more comprehensive evacuation of remaining native inhabitants to Cuba, unwilling to leave them under British colonial administration. Here is where the historical record grows genuinely, significantly uncertain in ways that go beyond the usual gaps of colonial-era documentation. Spanish records documenting these evacuations are notably inconsistent regarding exact numbers, and considerably more troubling regarding what happened to Calusa refugees after their arrival in Cuba. Some accounts suggest the transplanted population, already weakened by generations of disease and displacement, succumbed rapidly to unfamiliar Cuban diseases, harsh treatment, and the general devastation of forced relocation, effectively disappearing as a distinct community within a generation or two of arrival. Cuban colonial records from this period are fragmentary at best regarding the specific fate of Florida native refugees as a distinct population, and no clearly identifiable Calusa descendant community has ever been definitively traced within Cuba through documentary or genealogical research, despite periodic efforts by historians to do so. Is this because the refugee population genuinely died out entirely within a generation, its identity erased through mortality before it could be documented with any specificity? Or does the absence of a clearly traceable Calusa descendant community in Cuba simply reflect, once again, the broader pattern this exploration keeps encountering? Inadequate colonial-era record-keeping, particularly regarding the specific tribal identities of displaced and enslaved or quasi-enslaved indigenous populations, whose distinct origins were frequently collapsed into broader, less specific categories by the colonial administrators documenting them. There's a further complication that has drawn particular attention from historians and archaeologists in recent decades. Not all Calusa evacuated to Cuba. Some historical and archaeological evidence suggests that certain remaining Calusa individuals or small family groups, rather than accepting evacuation, instead withdrew further into the remote, difficult terrain of the Everglades and the 10,000 Islands region, areas so inaccessible that they would remain only lightly documented by outside observers for well over a century afterward. Some historians have proposed that these remaining groups may have eventually merged with, or been absorbed into, the Seminole and Miccosukee peoples who came to occupy much of the same South Florida territory in the decades that followed, having themselves migrated south from Georgia and Alabama throughout the 18th and early 19th centuries as they, too, sought refuge from expanding American settlement. This theory carries genuine archaeological support, continuity in certain material culture practices, and some linguistic and place name evidence suggesting Calusa influence persisting in the region after the primary evacuation to Cuba. But it remains difficult to establish with full confidence, precisely because the very isolation that would have allowed remaining Calusa groups to survive undetected also means they left correspondingly little documentary trace of that survival for later historians to examine. What makes the Calusa's disappearance particularly striking, when measured against the broader pattern this exploration has traced across numerous vanished and displaced nations, is the sheer scale of what was lost in such a historically compressed window. This was not a small band or a scattered confederacy, but a genuine urban civilization, one capable of engineering massive shell-built infrastructure, sustaining a population in the tens of thousands, and successfully resisting European military incursion for a century and a half through organized political and martial strength unmatched by most other indigenous societies in North America during the same period. And within roughly 2 further centuries following that resistance, that civilization had been reduced to the point of complete disappearance from the historical and archaeological record as a distinct, identifiable people. its final population scattered between an undocumented fate in colonial Cuba and a possible but unproven absorption into neighboring peoples within Florida itself. The shell mounds at Mount Key remain, rising from the shallow water much as they did when Calusa engineers first built them, their canals and watercourts still visible to archaeologists studying the site today. But the people who built them, who successfully turned back Ponce de Leon and generations of Spanish colonizers after him, who sustained one of the most sophisticated non-agricultural societies in recorded North American history, where did they ultimately go? Did the last of the Calusa truly disappear within the fragmentary, poorly documented Cuban refugee records of the 1760s? Or does some fragment of that civilization persist today, quietly absorbed generations ago into the Seminole and Miccosukee communities who now occupy much of the same extraordinary landscape the Calusa once mastered, their distinct identity dissolved but perhaps not, in the end, entirely erased? The shell mounds keep their silence. The watercourts still hold rainwater where captured fish once swam, and the specific fate of the people who engineered them all remains more than 250 years later, a question the historical record was simply never positioned to fully answer. Deep in the limestone canyons of the Texas Hill Country, near the headwaters of the San Saba River, generations of treasure hunters have dug, blasted, and searched for a mine that may never have existed in the form legend describes it. Yet the story has proven remarkably resistant to dying, fueled by documented Spanish colonial records, a genuinely mysterious 18th century massacre, and the simple, stubborn fact that silver has, in fact, been found in this region before. The legend goes by several names: the Lost San Saba Mine, Bowie's Lost Mine, sometimes simply the Lost Comanche Mine, and its various versions have circulated through Texas folklore for nearly 2 centuries. At its core, the story holds that somewhere in Comanche territory along the San Saba River, Spanish colonists operated a rich silver mine sometime in the mid-18th century, extracting significant wealth before the operation was violently destroyed, its location subsequently lost, and its remaining silver left buried, hidden, or simply abandoned in place. Unlike some of the treasure legends examined earlier in this exploration, this one has a genuinely documented historical anchor, and it's worth establishing clearly before wading into the more speculative layers built on top of it. In 1757, Spanish colonial authorities established the Santa Cruz de San Saba mission, along with an accompanying presidio, in what is now Menard County, Texas, intended primarily to Christianize and establish relations with the Lipan Apache, who inhabited the region. The mission's location, notably, was not selected by the Apache themselves, nor primarily for agricultural or strategic reasons, but reportedly at the urging of Apache leaders who suggested the specific site, a detail some later treasure hunters would seize upon as evidence the location held some additional significance the Spanish weren't initially told about. The mission's history was short and violent. On March 16, 1758, a large force of Comanche and allied Wichita, Tonkawa, and other northern plains warriors, estimates range from several hundred to over 1,000, making it one of the largest documented native military actions against a Spanish colonial installation in Texas history, attacked and destroyed the mission, killing several missionaries and burning the structure to the ground. The nearby Presidio survived the initial assault, though a subsequent Spanish punitive expedition against Comanche territory in 1759 ended in a costly defeat, and the entire San Saba colonial venture was effectively abandoned within a few years afterward. This much is documented in Spanish colonial military and mission records, cross-referenced with archaeological work at the mission and Presidio sites, which have been excavated and studied extensively by Texas historians and archaeologists. What isn't documented, at least not with anything approaching the same clarity, is the question at the center of the legend. Was there ever actually a productive silver mine associated with this mission, operating either before or during its brief existence? Here, the mainstream historical assessment grows considerably more skeptical than the popular legend allows for. No Spanish colonial mining records, tax documents, or shipment manifests from the period document a productive silver mine in the immediate San Saba region. Spanish colonial mining operations, when genuinely active, tended to generate substantial paper trails, required by the Crown for taxation purposes, and typically well documented in surviving archives in Mexico City and Spain. The near-total absence of such records for San Saba specifically has led most professional historians to conclude that if any mining activity occurred there at all, it was likely small-scale, exploratory, or entirely unsuccessful, nothing resembling the rich, productive silver operation the legend describes. So where did the legend come from, if the documentary evidence for an actual mine is this thin? Part of the answer lies in simple geological reality. The Llano Uplift region of central Texas, which includes the broader area around the San Saba River, does contain genuine mineral deposits, including documented, historically mined silver, iron, and other resources at various points in Texas history, though not precisely at the mission site itself. This geological truth gave the legend a plausible foundation to build on. The mineral wealth of the broader region was real, even if its specific association with the San Saba mission and its violent destruction may have been an assumption that later storytellers simply layered onto an already dramatic historical event. There's also a more specific and considerably more colorful thread woven into the legend's development: its connection to Jim Bowie, the famed frontiersman who would later die at the Alamo in 1836. According to well-documented Texas frontier history, Bowie led at least 2 expeditions in the early 1830s, specifically searching for the legendary San Saba silver mine, based on stories he'd reportedly heard from Mexican and native sources describing a rich Spanish mining operation somewhere in the region. His most famous expedition in 1831 resulted not in the discovery of silver, but in a fierce and well-documented battle with a large force of native warriors, likely a mixed group of Tawakoni, Waco, and Caddo fighters. Near the presumed mine location, a fight Bowie and his small party survived against considerable odds, later described in detail in his own account and subsequently mythologized extensively in Texas frontier folklore. Bowie's genuine documented search and his genuine documented survival of a serious battle in pursuit of it lent the legend a level of credibility and romantic frontier appeal that likely did more to cement it in popular Texas history than any actual evidence of the mine's existence ever could. Here we encounter a pattern this exploration has touched on before: a legend gaining staying power not necessarily because the underlying claim was true, but because a genuinely dramatic, well-documented event became closely associated with it, lending borrowed credibility to a claim that couldn't otherwise sustain itself on the actual evidence. And yet, dismissing the entire legend as pure invention runs into its own complications, ones that keep the mystery genuinely open rather than simply resolved in favor of skepticism. Comanche oral tradition, as recorded by later ethnographers and historians working with Comanche communities, includes references to the San Saba region holding particular significance. Though these accounts, when examined carefully, tend to emphasize the area's importance as contested hunting and raiding territory, and the 1758 mission attack as a defense of that territory against unwanted Spanish and Apache incursion, rather than confirming any specific knowledge of or particular interest in protecting a silver mine. This raises a genuinely interesting question about how the legend itself may have formed. Did Spanish colonial assumptions about Comanche motivations, assuming, as European colonizers frequently did, that any sustained indigenous resistance to a settlement must be protecting some valuable resource, retroactively attach a mining motive to an attack that may have had entirely different and arguably more straightforward origins rooted in territorial defense and resistance to colonial expansion? If so, this would mean the Comanche element of the legend's name may itself be a kind of historical misattribution, similar to the pattern already explored with Montezuma's treasure in various sites across the Southwest. An indigenous group's genuine, well-documented military action reinterpreted by outside observers through the lens of treasure and resource competition, rather than the political and territorial motivations the Comanche themselves would likely have described, had anyone thought to ask them directly at the time. Still, the legend has never entirely stopped drawing searchers, and the search itself has left its own small, strange trail of evidence over the subsequent 2 centuries. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, various treasure hunters have claimed to find old mine shafts, Spanish-era tools, and geological formations in the broader San Saba region, consistent with colonial-era mining activity. Though none of these findings has been definitively, professionally authenticated as connected to a large-scale silver operation, and several have been credibly identified by geologists as either natural formations or considerably later, smaller-scale mining attempts unrelated to the original Spanish colonial period. What, then, are we left with, once the documentary gaps, the geological plausibility, the possible colonial misattribution of Comanche motives, and Bowie's own genuine dramatic search are all weighed against each other? Perhaps a mine, modest and ultimately unsuccessful, briefly explored during the mission's short existence and left unrecorded simply because it produced too little to warrant the usual Spanish colonial paperwork. Perhaps no mine at all, only a violent, well-documented episode of indigenous resistance to colonial encroachment, later reimagined by outside storytellers eager to explain that resistance through the more familiar, more marketable lens of hidden wealth. Or perhaps, as the more persistent searchers still maintain, something genuinely valuable remains hidden in those limestone canyons along the San Saba, waiting for a level of exploration more thorough than 2 centuries of amateur searching has yet managed to achieve. The Presidio ruins still stand, partially reconstructed, along the river that gave the mission and the legend its name. The canyons beyond it remain largely as they were in 1758, rugged, arid, difficult to search comprehensively, even with modern equipment. Was Jim Bowie chasing a real mine when he rode into that 1831 battle, or chasing a story that had already, by then, outgrown whatever thin factual basis it may once have had? More than 2.5 centuries after the mission burned, the San Saba keeps its silence on the question, and the canyons along its banks have yet to give up an answer either way. In 1541, a Spanish expedition led by Francisco Vázquez de Coronado, marching deep into the interior of the North American continent in search of a legendary kingdom called Quivira, finally reached what its chroniclers described as a land of remarkable prosperity. Not gold, as Coronado had hoped, but something arguably more historically significant. A vast network of large, densely populated settlements, their grass-thatched houses stretching, according to Spanish accounts, for what may have been 20 miles or more along river valleys somewhere in present-day Kansas. This was the domain of the people the Spanish called the Quivirans, and whom later ethnographers and historians would identify as ancestral Wichita. What Coronado's expedition described, and what archaeologists have subsequently confirmed through extensive excavation, challenges a persistent popular assumption about pre-colonial life on the Great Plains. The image of small, scattered, purely nomadic bands following bison herds across open grassland. The ancestral Wichita built something considerably more substantial. Semi-permanent, large-scale agricultural settlements, with populations that some archaeological and historical estimates place in the tens of thousands across the broader Wichita cultural area, organized around sophisticated maize, bean, and squash cultivation supplemented by seasonal bison hunting. A hybrid economy that supported settlement density and social complexity considerably beyond what many outside observers, then and later, expected to find on the plains. Archaeological work at sites associated with this period, particularly clusters identified in central Kansas near the Arkansas River, has confirmed grasshouse structures built on a genuinely impressive scale, some measuring up to 40 feet in diameter, along with extensive storage pits, fortification ditches at certain sites, and trade goods indicating connections stretching from the Gulf Coast to the Rocky Mountains. This was not a marginal or peripheral society. By most current archaeological assessment, the Wichita settlements Coronado encountered represented one of the largest concentrations of population anywhere on the Great Plains prior to sustained European contact. And then, within roughly a century and a half of that first Spanish encounter, these great settlements had contracted so dramatically that by the time significant European documentation resumes in the 18th century, the Wichita appear in colonial records as a considerably smaller, more dispersed people, their population and settlement scale a fraction of what Coronado's chroniclers had described. What happened in the intervening period is where verified history gives way to a genuinely puzzling gap. The most immediately available explanation, and one with substantial supporting evidence, is disease. As with virtually every indigenous nation examined throughout this exploration, Old World pathogens moved through native populations well ahead of sustained direct European contact, traveling along existing trade networks that connected even relatively interior populations like the Wichita to coastal regions where Spanish and later French contact was more immediate and frequent. Epidemic disease alone, based on comparative mortality rates documented elsewhere in the Americas during this period, could plausibly account for population losses severe enough to explain the dramatic contraction between Coronado's 16th century account and the diminished settlements documented by French traders in the early 18th century. But disease alone doesn't fully satisfy historians who have studied this particular case closely, and here the mystery begins to deepen in ways that distinguish it from a simple story of epidemic collapse. The precise timeline is unusually difficult to pin down. Unlike some of the population collapses examined elsewhere in this exploration, where documented Spanish or French colonial presence provides at least intermittent written observation across the relevant decades, the region between Coronado's 1541 expedition and sustained French trade contact beginning in the late 17th century saw remarkably little direct outside documentation. Spanish colonial interest in the interior plains waned considerably after Coronado's expedition failed to find the gold he'd been promised, and French exploration of the same region didn't become consistent until decades later. This leaves a documentary gap of well over a century during which the ancestral Wichita's great settlements apparently transformed dramatically, with almost no outside written observation to establish when, how quickly, or through what specific combination of causes that transformation occurred. Archaeological evidence helps fill part of this gap, though it raises its own questions rather than resolving them entirely. Excavations at certain Wichita-associated sites show evidence of settlement contraction and, in some cases, apparent rapid abandonment, occurring in ways that don't always align neatly with the timeline disease alone would suggest. Some sites show signs of increased fortification in their final occupation phases, expanded defensive ditches, evidence of conflict-related structural damage, suggesting that whatever caused the dramatic population and settlement changes may have involved organized violence as a significant contributing factor, alongside or perhaps preceding the demographic impact of disease. This raises the question of who, exactly, the Wichita may have been in conflict with during this poorly documented period, and here historians have proposed several distinct, only partially compatible theories. One prominent explanation centers on the documented southward and westward expansion of Apache groups throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, driven in part by their own displacement pressures and increasing access to horses following Spanish introduction of the animal to the southwest. Apache oral tradition and some archaeological evidence suggests sustained conflict between Apache bands and plains agricultural peoples, including likely ancestral Wichita communities, throughout this period. Raids and counter-raids that, combined with the demographic pressure of disease, could plausibly have driven the contraction and consolidation of what had been much more extensive, dispersed settlements into the smaller, more defensively organized communities documented by French traders generations later. A second, somewhat overlapping theory involves the Wichita's own later well-documented historical relationship with the Comanche, whose southward migration onto the plains, accelerated dramatically by widespread horse adoption in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, reshaped nearly every aspect of plains political and economic life. By the time sustained French documentation of the region resumes, the Wichita and Comanche appear as established, generally cooperative trading partners, a relationship that would remain significant for the following century. But was this alliance the product of a more difficult, less documented earlier period of contact and adjustment, as Comanche expansion first pressed against Wichita territory before the two peoples settled into their later, better documented cooperative arrangement? Some historians have proposed exactly this, suggesting that the transition from Coronado's vast 16th century settlements to the smaller, differently organized communities of the 18th century may reflect not simply demographic collapse from disease, but a genuine multi-generational reorganization of Wichita society in response to the arrival of new, horse-mounted neighbors whose own presence on the southern plains was itself a consequence of the same broader colonial disruption reshaping the entire continent. What makes this particular gap so difficult to resolve with confidence is the near-total absence of Wichita oral tradition specifically addressing this transitional period in the detail that would allow historians to weigh these competing theories against first-hand testimony. This isn't for lack of effort on the part of later ethnographers. The Wichita language and cultural traditions were documented reasonably extensively beginning in the 19th and early 20th centuries. But the specific multi-generational transition between Coronado's 16th century Quivira and the considerably smaller, differently organized Wichita communities, documented by the 18th century, falls into a kind of historical shadow, discussed in broad terms by later oral tradition, but without the specific, datable detail that would allow researchers to construct a confident, granular narrative of exactly what happened, in what order, and why. There's a further complication worth sitting with, one that touches on a pattern this exploration has now encountered several times. The scale of what Coronado's expedition described in 1541, settlements stretching for potentially 20 miles, populations in the tens of thousands, has occasionally been questioned by historians as possibly exaggerated, whether through simple observational error, deliberate embellishment intended to justify the expedition's considerable cost to the Spanish crown, or genuine difficulty translating and interpreting what Spanish observers were seeing through their own cultural framework. Archaeological evidence has, in recent decades, increasingly supported the broad outline of Coronado's account rather than dismissing it as pure exaggeration. But the precise population figures remain a matter of ongoing scholarly debate, which in turn affects how dramatic historians consider the subsequent contraction to have actually been. Was this a catastrophic collapse from a genuinely vast 16th century population, or a more moderate contraction from a somewhat smaller starting point than Coronado's chroniclers, dazzled by what was still an impressively large settlement network, initially reported? Even accounting for this uncertainty in the starting numbers, the core mystery remains largely intact. Something happened to the ancestral Wichita's great settlements between 1541 and the early 18th century. A transformation substantial enough that French traders encountering the Wichita in the 1700s had no clear awareness that they were dealing with the diminished descendants of a society Spanish chroniclers had once described in terms approaching genuine wonder. Disease almost certainly played a significant role. Conflict, whether with expanding Apache bands, arriving Comanche groups, or some combination of pressures historians haven't yet fully identified, likely compounded that demographic pressure. But the specific sequence, the specific timeline, and the specific lived experience of the generations who witnessed their society's transformation from Coronado's sprawling Quivira into the smaller, reorganized communities of the following century remains, in the most literal sense, undocumented. A century and a half of history that exists for us now primarily as the space between two very different outside descriptions, with almost nothing recorded from within to bridge the gap. Somewhere beneath the wheat fields and river valleys of central Kansas, archaeologists continue to identify new sites, new fragments of this larger, unresolved story. Storage pits, fortification remnants, trade goods that hint at connections and conflicts still not fully mapped. Each new excavation adds detail without yet resolving the central question. What, precisely, transformed one of the largest and most prosperous societies on the entire Great Plains into a considerably smaller people within roughly 6 generations, largely beyond the reach of any outside chronicler to record as it happened? Coronado's Quivira described a horizon crowded with grass-roofed houses, stretching farther than his soldiers could easily measure. What passed through that landscape in the century and a half that followed, reshaping it so thoroughly that later visitors could scarcely have guessed what had once stood there, remains one of the Great Plains' most substantial and most quietly overlooked, unsolved histories. Not every artifact examined in this exploration was lost to war, disease, or displacement. Some vanished by a stranger, more deliberate route, collected, cataloged and quietly absorbed into institutions thousands of miles from the communities that had maintained them, sometimes for centuries, as objects considered too sacred to be seen, let alone owned, by anyone outside a small circle of designated keepers. Among many plains and woodland nations, medicine bundles occupy a category of object that doesn't translate comfortably into Western frameworks of art, artifact, or property. A bundle might contain pipes, feathers, animal parts, stones, or other materials, wrapped and maintained according to specific protocols, its contents and significance often known fully only to its keeper and a limited number of others authorized to understand it. These weren't museum pieces or decorative items. Among nations including the Blackfoot, Pawnee, Crow, and many others, certain bundles were understood to carry spiritual responsibility passed down through specific lineages or societies, their proper maintenance considered essential to the well-being of the community itself. Losing a bundle wasn't simply losing an object. It represented, in many documented accounts, a genuine spiritual and communal loss, comparable in weight to losing access to ceremony itself. This is where the historical record becomes uncomfortable in ways distinct from the wars, displacements, and epidemics examined elsewhere in this exploration, because much of what happened to these bundles wasn't the product of violent conflict or catastrophic disease. It was the product of collection, conducted largely during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, by museums, private collectors, and anthropologists operating under a prevailing and now widely discredited assumption that native cultures were vanishing and that their material culture needed to be preserved by outside institutions before it disappeared entirely. The documented scale of this collection is substantial. Major museums across the United States and Europe acquired thousands of sacred and ceremonial objects from native nations during this period, through purchase, through exchange, and in a considerable number of well-documented cases, through methods that ranged from ethically questionable to outright theft. Items taken from unattended ceremonial sites, purchased under circumstances where the seller may not have had genuine authority to part with a communally significant object, or acquired from individuals during periods of severe economic hardship or forced relocation, when refusing an offered price for a sacred item may not have felt like a real choice at all. Some of this history is unusually well documented, if unflattering to the institutions and individuals involved. Collectors and early anthropologists frequently kept detailed records of their acquisitions, in some cases recording, with what reads now as startling frankness, the specific circumstances under which sacred objects changed hands, including instances where collectors acknowledged, in their own contemporary notes, that community members were reluctant, that elders objected, or that the transaction occurred under conditions of clear economic or political pressure, rather than genuine voluntary exchange. The passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in 1990 finally established a formal legal framework requiring federally funded museums and agencies to inventory Native American human remains, funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony in their collections, and to work with federally recognized tribes toward their return. In the decades since, the law has facilitated the return of many thousands of items, including a significant number of medicine bundles and other sacred objects, to their communities of origin. This represents genuine documented progress on a history that, for most of the preceding century, saw almost no formal mechanism for return at all. But NAGPRA's implementation has also revealed the considerable scale of what remains unresolved, and this is where the mystery genuinely deepens. Compliance with the law's inventory and repatriation requirements has been, by the assessment of federal oversight reports and numerous independent researchers, deeply uneven across the museum and institutional landscape. Some institutions have engaged in the process thoroughly and in good faith. Others, according to documented federal compliance reviews, have been considerably slower, less transparent, or, in a number of specific documented cases, have claimed items were unidentifiable as to their culturally affiliated nation, or have disputed a requesting tribe's claim of cultural affiliation, in ways that critics, including tribal representatives directly involved in these disputes, have characterized as institutional foot-dragging, rather than genuine uncertainty. A 2023 investigative review found that despite more than 3 decades since the law's passage, tens of thousands of Native American remains and sacred and culturally significant objects, including numerous medicine bundles, remained in institutional holdings, still not returned to identified or identifiable tribal nations. This alone represents a documented, ongoing situation rather than a resolved historical episode, a genuinely unsettled circumstance in the present tense, not simply the past. But it doesn't yet address the deeper, more specifically mysterious layer of this particular story. The bundles and other sacred objects, whose current location isn't merely undisclosed or delayed in bureaucratic process, but genuinely unknown. Museum and private collection records from the late 19th and early 20th centuries are, even by the standards of that era's generally inconsistent documentation practices, notably unreliable when it comes to sacred objects specifically. Some collectors, aware even at the time that certain items had been acquired under circumstances their own institutions might later question, appear to have deliberately obscured provenance details in their records. Vague attributions to a general tribal or regional identity rather than a specific community, incomplete or altered accounts of how and from whom an item was actually obtained, or simple absence of documentation entirely for objects that nonetheless entered permanent institutional collections. This pattern, well documented by researchers working through museum archives during the NAGPRA compliance process, means that a meaningful number of sacred objects held in American and European institutions cannot currently be matched with confidence to any specific community of origin. Not because the information never existed, but because it appears, in a number of cases, to have been deliberately withheld or falsified by the very collectors responsible for the object's removal in the first place. Beyond institutional collections lies an even less documented category: sacred objects that pass through private hands, sold at auction, traded among collectors, or held in personal collections that were never formally cataloged or donated to any public institution at all. These objects exist entirely outside the reach of NAGPRA's framework, which applies specifically to federally funded museums and agencies, not private individuals. Auction records from the 20th century document the sale of numerous items identified, sometimes explicitly in the auction listing itself, as Native American sacred or ceremonial objects, their subsequent private ownership and current location, in many documented cases, untraceable through any public record. Here the mystery takes on a genuinely unsettling dimension, distinct from questions of institutional compliance or delayed bureaucratic process. Tribal historians and cultural preservation officers working across numerous nations have documented specific accounts, passed down through community memory, and in some cases corroborated by fragmentary historical records, of particular, named bundles known to have existed within their communities as recently as the late 19th or early 20th century, whose current whereabouts are genuinely unknown to anyone still living. Not held in a museum awaiting repatriation, not documented in any known private collection. Simply gone, their trail vanishing somewhere in the decades between their last confirmed community presence and the present day. What happened to these specific identifiable bundles? Some were likely acquired by private collectors whose personal holdings were eventually dispersed, sold, or inherited without adequate documentation, effectively erasing any traceable path forward. Some may have been destroyed, by fire, by neglect, by collectors or their descendants who, not understanding or valuing what they possessed, simply discarded items that had lost whatever novelty or curiosity value had motivated their original acquisition. And some, according to accounts that occupy a more genuinely uncertain space between documented history and community oral tradition, may still exist somewhere, held unknowingly or knowingly in private collections whose owners have no public record of their holdings, or misidentified in smaller institutional collections that lack the resources or expertise to properly research and catalog everything they hold. There's a further, quieter layer to this mystery worth sitting with, one that speaks less to the physical location of missing bundles and more to what their absence has meant for the communities who lost them. For nations where specific ceremonial practices were tied directly to the presence and proper maintenance of a particular bundle, the loss of that object sometimes meant, in documented cases, the effective interruption or discontinuation of the ceremony itself. Not simply the loss of an artifact, but the severing of a specific, unbroken practice that had been maintained in some cases for many generations prior to its bundle's removal. In a limited number of cases, communities have worked to reconstruct or adapt ceremonial practice in the absence of an original bundle, guided by the knowledge of remaining elders and practitioners. In others, the interruption has proven considerably harder to bridge, particularly where the specific knowledge required for a ceremony's proper performance had been held closely by a small number of authorized keepers, whose own passing, without a bundle to anchor the tradition's continuation, meant the loss of specific ceremonial knowledge alongside the loss of the object itself. This is, in its way, one of the more quietly devastating mysteries examined in this exploration, not because it involves a single dramatic disappearance, but because it represents an ongoing, ordinary, still unresolved pattern, playing out across dozens of nations and hundreds, likely thousands, of individual objects, each with its own specific history and its own specific gap where an answer should be. Somewhere in a private collection whose owner has no idea what they actually possess. Somewhere in a museum storage room whose records were falsified or lost decades ago. Somewhere, perhaps, simply lost to fire or neglect or the ordinary erosion of unrecorded time. These bundles remain unaccounted for, their absence still felt by communities who have not stopped asking after them. How many sacred objects, taken during a period historians now broadly acknowledge as one of institutionalized cultural appropriation, remain genuinely unlocated more than a century later? No comprehensive figure exists, precisely because the scale of what's missing can only be estimated against records that were, in a meaningful number of documented cases, never accurate to begin with. And for the communities still asking the question, the search itself, decades after these objects first disappeared from their proper keepers' hands, remains very much unfinished. If the loss of medicine bundles represents a story of sacred objects severed from their communities, the mystery that follows concerns something stranger still. A sacred practice that never disappeared at all, remains actively maintained today, and yet whose deepest origins remain genuinely, deliberately unknown even to many of the people who continue to carry it forward. Among the Beothuk, known to most outside observers as the Crow Nation of what is now southern Montana, there exists a specific variety of cultivated tobacco, distinct from the wild tobacco found throughout the region, maintained and grown according to protocols understood fully only by initiated members of the Tobacco Society, one of the oldest continuously practiced ceremonial institutions among Plains nations, and one whose foundational origin story occupies a genuinely unusual space between documented cultural practice and a mystery that has, by design, never been fully resolved for outsiders, and by some accounts, not entirely resolved even within the tradition itself. Here is what can be established with reasonable historical and ethnobotanical confidence. The tobacco cultivated by the Crow Tobacco Society is a distinct cultivar, botanically identified in modern research as Nicotiana quadrivalvis, notably different from the commercial tobacco varieties, Nicotiana tabacum and Nicotiana rustica, that dominate most historical and contemporary tobacco cultivation across North America. This particular variety appears to have been maintained in cultivation by the Crow and, in related forms, by certain neighboring plains and plateau nations, across a span of time that oral tradition places well before any European contact, and that botanical researchers studying the plant's genetic characteristics have found consistent with a long history of deliberate, isolated cultivation distinct from wild tobacco populations in the surrounding region. This is, in itself, a significant and well-documented fact. A specific cultivated plant variety, maintained through careful seed selection and ceremonial protocol across many generations, existing as what botanists sometimes describe as a kind of living cultural artifact, genetically and functionally distinct from tobacco grown for ordinary use, its cultivation inseparable from the ceremonial institution responsible for maintaining it. The Tobacco Society itself is documented extensively in ethnographic literature dating back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when researchers including Robert Lowy conducted detailed studies of Crow social and ceremonial organization. According to these accounts, corroborated and elaborated upon by Crow cultural knowledge keepers in subsequent generations, the Tobacco Society functioned as one of several important ceremonial and social organizations within Crow society, membership in which was obtained through a specific adoption process rather than inheritance alone, and which carried responsibilities including the ceremonial planting, tending, and harvesting of the sacred tobacco, according to protocols understood to be essential not merely to the plant's successful cultivation, but to the broader spiritual and communal well-being the society's practices were understood to sustain. This much is documented with reasonable clarity, cross-reference between outside ethnographic observation and, more significantly, sustained testimony and continued practice from within the Crow community itself, extending into the present day. The Tobacco Society was not destroyed, dispersed, or lost to the forces of displacement and violence that ended so many ceremonial traditions examined elsewhere in this exploration. It survived, and by most accounts continues to be actively practiced today, representing a genuine, unbroken thread of ceremonial continuity, extending back well beyond the documentary record's ability to date it precisely. So, where exactly does the mystery lie in a tradition this well documented and this successfully preserved? It lies specifically in origin, in the foundational story explaining how the Crow came to possess this particular sacred plant and the ceremonial knowledge required to maintain it. A story that exists in multiple versions across different accounts, some elements of which are shared relatively openly, and others of which are understood, by design and by long-standing protocol, to be restricted specifically to initiated members of the society, not recorded in full detail in any outside ethnographic account, and not, according to the tradition's own internal logic, meant to be fully accessible to those outside its specific ceremonial structure. Publicly shared versions of the origin account generally describe the tobacco and its associated ceremonial knowledge as having been received through a supernatural encounter, often associated with the culture hero figure known as No Vitals, or in some tellings connected to the broader migration narrative describing the Crow people's separation from the Hidatsa and their subsequent journey to the territory they would come to occupy in what is now Montana and Wyoming. In several documented versions, the tobacco seed itself is described as having been given through a vision or direct encounter with a spiritual being, its cultivation thereafter tied specifically to the maintenance of a particular relationship or promise established during that founding encounter, a sacred obligation, passed down through the society's membership, to continue the plant's cultivation as a condition of the broader well-being the original gift was understood to provide. What makes this origin account a genuine, structurally different kind of mystery from most others examined in this exploration is that its full resolution isn't something historical research is expected, or in most cases even permitted, to provide. Unlike the disappearance of a people, the loss of a specific object, or the ambiguous fate of a historical population, the deeper layers of the Tobacco Society's origin story are, by the tradition's own internal protocol, understood to be restricted knowledge, shared only with initiated members, transmitted through specific ceremonial contexts, and deliberately not recorded in complete form in any outside historical or ethnographic source, including sources produced with considerable Crow cooperation and input. This raises a genuinely different kind of question than most of the mysteries this exploration has examined. Is there, in fact, a more complete, verifiable historical account of how this particular tobacco variety came to be cultivated by the Crow, perhaps involving trade or exchange with a neighboring nation at some point in the deeper past, perhaps involving a more mundane process of agricultural development and selection over many generations, that has simply never been shared with outside researchers, preserved instead entirely within the society's own restricted oral tradition? Or does the origin story's supernatural framing represent, within the tradition's own understanding, the most complete and accurate account that exists at all, with no separate, more conventionally historical version underlying it? From outside the tradition, this isn't a question that can be, or arguably should be, definitively answered. The restriction itself is part of the tradition's structure, not an accidental gap in the documentary record waiting to be filled by sufficiently persistent outside research. This distinction matters considerably, and it's worth pausing on directly. Several of the mysteries examined throughout this exploration involve gaps in the historical record that exist because documentation was destroyed, never created, or deliberately falsified by outside observers, and where fuller understanding, in principle, could still be recovered through more thorough research, newly discovered records, or renewed archaeological work. The Crow Tobacco Society's origin account occupies different territory entirely, a case where restricted knowledge exists specifically because the tradition itself has determined across many generations that certain elements should remain within a defined ceremonial context, transmitted through initiation rather than published or broadly shared. Treating this as a mystery to be solved through outside investigation would, in a meaningful sense, misunderstand what kind of knowledge it actually represents, and would run directly against the specific, deliberate protocols the tradition's own keepers have maintained for as long as outside researchers have been aware of the society's existence. And yet the botanical evidence remains genuinely, independently intriguing, regardless of how the ceremonial origin story is ultimately understood. Nicotiana quadrivalvis is not native to the immediate Yellowstone and Bighorn region the Crow have occupied throughout their documented history in Montana and Wyoming. Its closest wild relatives and probable region of original domestication are generally associated with areas farther west and south, raising real, unresolved questions among ethnobotanists about the specific historical pathway, whether through trade, migration, or some other form of cultural exchange, by which this particular cultivar came into Crow hands, and how long ago that transfer actually occurred. Genetic and archaeological research into the deeper history of domesticated tobacco varieties across North America remains an active, ongoing field, and the specific chronology connecting the Crow Tobacco Society's cultivated variety to its likely regions of earlier domestication has not been definitively established by researchers working from the botanical and archaeological evidence alone, independent of whatever fuller account the Society's own restricted tradition may hold. What remains, then, is a genuinely layered mystery, different in character from most others in this exploration. A sacred plant, botanically distinct and demonstrably ancient in its cultivation, tended continuously by a ceremonial institution that has survived, largely intact, across a span of documented history stretching back further than written record can reach. An origin story, partially shared and partially restricted by design, whose fullest version exists only within a living tradition that has determined, deliberately and consistently, not to make that fuller account available to outside inquiry, and a body of independent botanical evidence, genuinely unresolved by researchers working entirely outside the ceremonial tradition, that raises real questions about the plant's deeper history without being able to answer them. Is the full story of how the Crow came to carry this particular sacred tobacco a piece of history that has simply never been recorded outside the Tobacco Society's own restricted knowledge, known in complete form only to those who have gone through the specific process of initiation the tradition requires? Or does even that fuller, restricted account leave certain deeper questions unresolved, the plant's true origins and the precise ancient encounter that first brought it into Crow hands remaining genuinely uncertain even within the tradition that has carried it forward, generation after generation, for longer than any outside record can measure? For those outside the society, this may be one mystery in this exploration destined to remain exactly, deliberately, as it has always been. Not lost, not forgotten, but simply, respectfully, not fully ours to know. Just as the Crow Tobacco Society's deepest origins remain protected within ceremonial memory, the story that follows involves a very different kind of knowledge gap, one created not by deliberate sacred protection, but by the deliberate secrecy of a trade built on exploitation, whose sudden collapse still leaves historians reconstructing exactly what was lost and exactly why it ended when it did. Near the confluence of the St. Mary and Oldman rivers, in what is now southern Alberta, stands a reconstruction of Fort Whoop-Up, a sprawling wooden stockade that, in its original form during the early 1870s, served as the center of one of the most destructive and least formally documented trade networks in the history of the Northern Plains. Unlike the Hudson's Bay Company posts and formal trading operations that dominated most of Canada's fur trade history, Fort Whoop-Up operated largely outside any government oversight, built and run by American traders who had crossed north from Montana Territory into what was then essentially unpoliced Canadian territory, drawn by the opportunity to trade a product the Hudson's Bay Company's own regulations, whatever their other shortcomings, generally prohibited. Whiskey. The documented history here is grim, but relatively clear in its broad outline. Beginning around 1869 and 1870, American traders, most notably John Jerome Healy and Alfred B. Hamilton, established Fort Whoop-Up and a network of smaller satellite trading posts throughout the region, trading a crude, often severely adulterated whiskey, frequently cut with ingredients that ranged from tobacco and red pepper to, according to some contemporary accounts, considerably more dangerous additives, directly to Blackfoot Confederacy bands and other Plains peoples of the region, in exchange for buffalo robes and furs. This trade proved catastrophically destructive with unusual speed, contributing directly to documented spikes in violence, both between different native groups and within communities themselves, alongside severe health consequences from the whiskey's frequently toxic composition, and a broader disruption of trade and social patterns that had previously operated through more established, regulated channels. The scale and destructiveness of the whiskey trade became significant enough that it directly precipitated one of the foundational events in Canadian federal policy toward its western territories: the creation of the Northwest Mounted Police, established by the Canadian government in 1873, substantially in direct response to reports of the violence and disorder associated with Fort Whoop-Up and similar posts, reports that reached a particular crisis point following the Cypress Hills Massacre of June 1873, in which a group of American wolf hunters and traders killed a number of Assiniboine people in a dispute connected to the broader tensions of the whiskey trade economy. In 1874, the newly formed Mounted Police undertook their famous March West, arriving at Fort Whoop-Up in October of that year, specifically intending to shut the whiskey trade down. Here, the documented history takes its first genuinely puzzling turn. According to the Mounted Police's own contemporary accounts, when they finally arrived at Fort Whoop-Up after their long march west, expecting to confront a heavily armed, actively operating criminal trading post, they found instead a fort that was, by most accounts, already largely abandoned or peacefully operating on a much reduced scale, its most notorious traders already gone, offering little or no resistance to the police's arrival. The dramatic confrontation many had anticipated simply didn't occur. Mainstream historical explanation for this anticlimactic arrival generally centers on advance warning. The traders at Fort Whoop-Up and similar posts, according to this account, had likely received word of the Mounted Police's approach well before their actual arrival, given the months-long duration of the march west and the extensive network of contacts and communication that existed among traders throughout the region, and had simply had ample time to relocate their operations, dispose of or hide their whiskey stocks, and present a considerably less incriminating scene than the one the police had expected to find. This explanation is plausible and well supported by what's documented about the general pace and visibility of the Mounted Police's approach. But it doesn't fully account for several more specific gaps in the historical record that continue to puzzle researchers studying this period. The first concerns the fate of the broader trade network itself, extending well beyond Fort Whoop-Up's main stockade. Historical records, including trader accounts and later historical reconstruction, indicate that the whiskey trade operated through a considerably larger network of smaller, more informal posts and trading relationships scattered throughout the region, some permanent structures, others closer to mobile trading operations conducted directly with specific bands at agreed meeting points. The Mounted Police's arrival at Fort Whoop-Up itself is well documented. What happened to this broader, more diffuse network of satellite trading relationships is considerably less clear, since most of it left no comparable physical structure for later historians or archaeologists to locate and study. and its participants, both traders and native trading partners, generally left far less documentary trace of their specific activities than the operators of the main fort did. Did this broader network simply collapse alongside Fort Whoopup's main operation, its traders scattering back across the border into Montana territory in the same general period? Or did some portion of it continue operating for a longer period than the standard historical narrative, focused primarily on the dramatic main fort, generally acknowledges? Smaller, more mobile operations proving more difficult for the mounted police's limited early manpower to locate and suppress than the fixed, well-known structure at Whoop-Up itself. Some historians researching mounted police enforcement records from the mid to late 1870s have suggested exactly this, pointing to continued, if reduced, reports of whiskey-related incidents throughout the region for several years after 1874, well past the point when the main trade through Fort Whoop-Up itself is generally considered to have ended. The second, and arguably more significant gap, concerns the Blackfoot Confederacy's own side of this trade relationship, which is documented considerably less thoroughly than the American traders' operations, for reasons that reflect a broader pattern this exploration has encountered repeatedly. The overwhelming majority of surviving written records from this period were produced by traders, missionaries, and later government officials, not by the Blackfoot themselves, whose own understanding of the trade's operation, its participants, and its ultimate collapse exists primarily through oral tradition, rather than the kind of detailed written record available for the American side of the exchange. What is documented through both outside accounts and Blackfoot oral history recorded by later ethnographers is that the whiskey trade's impact on Blackfoot communities was severe, and in the assessment of Blackfoot elders and historians in subsequent generations, deliberately exploitative. A trade that outside traders understood to be causing significant harm, and that some documented accounts suggest was specifically targeted at moments of particular vulnerability within Blackfoot communities, timed to periods of scarcity or hardship when trading terms could be made most favorable to the American operators at the direct expense of their Blackfoot trading partners. This raises a question that mainstream historical accounts, generally organized around the perspective of the mounted police's arrival and enforcement action, have addressed considerably less thoroughly than they might. What was the specific internal Blackfoot response to this trade during its operation, and to its eventual, at least officially declared, end? Some Blackfoot oral tradition, recorded by later researchers working directly with community knowledge keepers, describes internal debate and disagreement among different bands and leaders regarding how to respond to the whiskey trade while it operated. Between those who saw engagement with the trade, however destructive, as a pragmatic necessity given the broader economic pressures reshaping Plains life during this period of rapid bison decline and increasing settler encroachment, and those who actively opposed and resisted the trade's presence within their own communities, sometimes through direct confrontation with traders themselves. This internal complexity is generally underrepresented in mainstream historical accounts of Fort Whoop-Up, which tend to center the American traders and the mounted police as the primary historical actors, with Blackfoot communities positioned largely as the trade's victims rather than as people actively debating, resisting, and shaping their own response to an exploitative and rapidly evolving situation. There's a further, more genuinely unresolved question sitting beneath this history, one that connects Fort Whoop-Up's abandonment to a much larger, still debated pattern in Plains history during this exact period. The early to mid-1870s, precisely when the whiskey trade reached its peak and then collapsed, also marked the beginning of the catastrophic final decline of the Plains bison population, driven by a combination of commercial hide hunting, railroad expansion, and, according to some historians, deliberate policy choices by both American and Canadian authorities, who recognized the bison's centrality to native economic and political independence. How much did the whiskey trade's own destructive economic pressure on Blackfoot communities, disrupting traditional trade relationships, creating dependency on a trade good that offered nothing of lasting value in exchange for resources increasingly difficult to replace, compound or accelerate the broader crisis the bison's decline was already creating? Historians studying this period have generally treated these as related but separately analyzed phenomena. The whiskey trade and the bison collapse, each documented through their own separate body of evidence, without a fully integrated account of exactly how these simultaneous pressures interacted within specific Blackfoot communities experiencing both at once. What remains at the reconstructed fort near Lethbridge today is a physical structure that can be toured, studied, and reasonably well understood in terms of its basic operational history. What remains considerably less certain is the fuller texture of the trade network it anchored. How far its informal, undocumented branches actually extended, how long portions of it may have continued operating beyond the point the official historical narrative marks as its end, and what internal Blackfoot deliberation, resistance, and adaptation occurred throughout its operation and its collapse, largely undocumented by the outside observers whose records form the primary basis for most accounts of this period. The mounted police found an empty fort in October 1874, its most dramatic evidence already gone. But an empty fort, however historically significant its abandonment, tells us considerably less about what actually happened throughout the surrounding trade network and within the communities most affected by it than the tidy ending of the standard historical account might suggest. How much of this trade's true extent and its true cost still remains outside the reach of the documentary record it left behind,